Well, we'll start now the fourth session of the Decarbonizing Transport in an Unprecedented Global Crisis Conference. I say good morning or good evening, depending where you are, to all participants and attendees to this virtual conference and to this session that today will focus on the railways, particularly on freight railways and their role in decarbonizing the transport system in logistics, with the background and with on the context of this global crisis we are living, caused by the COVID pandemic. My name is Francisco Furtado from the International Transport Forum. I will be doing a small introduction to the conference itself, also providing some technical details to all our participants, and then I'll pass the word to the moderator of today, which will be Julieta Abad. Uh, I'll start to highlight that we have interpretation available. You can listen to this session both in English or in Spanish. For that, you can click on an icon on the bottom of your screen or the Zoom application, and you'll see there's a small world. If you click there, you can then click on the language you're more comfortable with, English or Spanish. We advise that you do not mute the original audio, because this way you will be able to listen in your preferred language throughout the entire conference, regardless if the speaker is speaking in Spanish or if the speaker is speaking in English. You'll always hear in the language of the channel that you chose. For instance, if you chose the English channel, you'll listen in English when the speaker is speaking in English, and you will hear the translation when the speaker is speaking in Spanish. Um, some words about the conference and some backgrounds about this conference. This is part of a wider project. It's part of the Decarbonizing Transport in Emerging Economies project, a project that is being implemented by the International Transport Forum, also by the Wuppertal Institute, and which is funded by the International Climate Initiative of the German Environmental Ministry. This is a project that covers 4 countries and their respective regions, the countries being Argentina, Morocco, Azerbaijan, and India. Um, the conference and that we are doing today is part of the Argentina chapter of this project. Argentina, and I would say more widely Latin American chapter of this project. And in the Argentinian part, we always had the cooperation of the Transport Ministry in Argentina, um, and in specific for this conference, we also have the cooperation of the Sustentar Association, which is part of the LEDSLAC regional platform. An important feature is that all of the recordings, all of the videos of these sessions and the presentations are available online. If you see the first link in the slide, and I believe my colleagues are sharing it also in the chat function of Zoom, all the recordings and presentations of the previous sessions that happened last week are already available. Um, we also have 2 hashtags for dissemination, discussion on Twitter. There is a LinkedIn group also where all of this information is available, and where also, and I invite you to do this, to join the group and to post questions in this LinkedIn group. Inclusively, you can put questions for these sessions before they happen. So you can place your questions there, and then during the session itself, we will the moderators will bring the questions during the question and answer phase of this session. And of course, there's also a website with the agenda, with the full list of speakers, and more information about the conference and each of the sessions. Um, the conference itself started last week, as I was mentioning, on the 7th of July. It will go until the 30th of July. There are 9 open sessions in total. And today, as I was mentioning, is the 4th session, and it's the session dedicated to the railways, more in particular, the freight railways, because I should mention that this decarbonizing transport and emerging economies project is acting on 4 different countries, and the topics that are approached in these countries differ from country to country. And in the Argentinian case, there is a higher focus, a bigger highlight on freight and logistics, also giving the nature of the country, the size of the country, and the importance of moving commodities, grains, other freight throughout the country, and the importance this has to decarbonize the transport system. Uh, some additional words on the technical side. During the session, you can see the chat. There is a chat function below in your screen. You can click on it. There's a window that opens, and we will be posting there links to several resources related with the conference, like the links I was displaying before, but also some reports of this project and other relevant information. And another important tool at your disposal is the Q&A, the question and answers feature. You can click on it, you can write your question. I ask when you write your question to also address it to one of the speakers today. And I give a word of advice based on our past experience, which is to pose these questions sooner rather than later, because we will look at every one of them. We will transmit them to the moderator. The moderator is the one that will then out loud ask the questions to the speakers. But it's when you leave your questions towards the tail end and the end of the question and answer period, then it becomes hard for that question to be addressed. So I would advise that during the presentation phase and right at the beginning of the Q&A, you pose your questions so that they can be answered during this session. In case they are not, one of the things we are working on is also to have these questions, particularly the ones that are not answered, also debated in the LinkedIn group I was mentioning. But without further delays, let me present the moderator for today. She's Julieta Abad. She's a lead transport specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. She has a great swath of experience in transportation, uh, particularly in railways, not only, but particularly in railways, in railway projects, approaching railway topics. She's also extremely familiar with the situation both in Argentina and Latin America. And without further ado, Julieta, I pass the word to you.
Muchas gracias, Francisco.
Thank you,
Buenos
Francisco.
días, buenas
Good
tardes,
morning,
según el
good
lugar desde
afternoon,
donde
according
nos
to
escuchen. Yo
where
soy
you're listening
Julieta
to.
Abad, soy
My name is
especialista en
Julieta Abad.
transporte
I
del
am
Banco Interamericano
a lead
de
transport
Desarrollo y estoy
specialist in
basada
the
en Buenos
IDB,
Aires. Primero
and I
quería
live in Buenos
agradecer
Aires. I
al
first wanted to
International
thank
Transport Forum, al
the
Wuppertal
International Transport
Institute, a la
Forum, the
Asociación
Wuppertal
Sustentar por la
Institute,
invitación
and
a
the
moderar este
Sustentar
evento
Association
tan
for inviting me
interesante.
to moderate
Vamos a
this
hablar, como
interesting
dijo
event. We will
Francisco,
speak, as
de
Francisco said,
estrategias de
about
descarbonización del
strategies for
transporte ferroviario de carga en tiempos
decarbonizing
de crisis. Los organizadores
freight
han planteado una serie de preguntas amplias que tienen que ver con los impactos que la crisis ha tenido en el sector de los ferrocarriles de carga y con las oportunidades y retos que el sector enfrenta a futuro, especialmente en las economías emergentes. Para conversar sobre estos temas tenemos a un panel de primera línea compuesto por Jan Abenga de Sudáfrica, por Jorge Kogan de Argentina, por Alejandro Álvarez Reyes de México y por Jorge Kohn de Argentina. Sobre el final, Azar Jaimursina de UNISCAP va a hacer unos breves comentarios. Estoy segura de que nos vamos a llevar mucha información y mensajes interesantes de lo que vamos a conversar en las próximas 2 horas. Y de esta breve introducción que me toca hacer, quizá el único mensaje que quisiera que se lleven es uno, y es que desde el Banco Interamericano pensamos que los ferrocarriles de carga tienen un rol clave para mejorar el desempeño logístico de la región. Y es por eso que los hemos estudiado en detalle. Ocupan un rol importante en la agenda de conocimiento del banco. Y ahí viene el mensaje, y es que dentro del próximo mes vamos a estar publicando un análisis sobre el desempeño de las concesiones ferroviarias de carga en los últimos 25 años en la región. El reporte analiza varios aspectos de los ferrocarriles. La verdad que miramos con bastante detalle el negocio, entendemos que es un negocio privado en el cual el sector público tiene una capacidad muy importante de definir ciertas reglas y ciertas condiciones de borde que facilitan o no el desarrollo de ese negocio. Lo miramos un poco en retrospectiva, pensando en algunas recomendaciones o perspectivas a futuro. Es un informe que desarrollamos conjuntamente Jorge Kohn y yo, así que va a estar disponible y creo que va a estar bastante publicitado a través de los canales institucionales del banco. Sin más, quisiera presentar al primer panelista. Jan Abenga es profesor titular de logística en la Universidad de Stellenbosch en Sudáfrica, donde obtuvo su PhD. Es un especialista en redes de suministro y en macrologística, promotor del renacimiento de la importancia económica de los ferrocarriles e investigador. Ha dirigido muchos equipos de investigación y consultoría sobre estos temas alrededor del mundo. También es parte de una red de investigadores que trabajan en pro de objetivos de logística sostenible, de mejorar estrategias para su medición y de la modelización de flujos para sistemas logísticos nacionales. Y sin más, le paso la palabra a Jan Abenga.
Jan Abenga, you have
Jan,
the floor.
adelante.
Go ahead, Jan.
Net te controleren. I had it open and now it's disappeared. Was in a share screen. I had it open and now it's disappeared in this last minute. I don't believe this. No, I don't understand this. Does this work? My screen is there. I'm sorry, I had it open. Thank you, Juliet. I really appreciate this. And Francisco, I appreciate this opportunity to talk about this. I'll try and be quick. I'll have to give a little bit of my own context, why I think decarbonization is important. Talk a little bit about trade, a little bit about Argentina, and I'll say why it's only a little bit. Rail market spaces, as I call it, and then rail in a sustainable roadmap of the world. For me, I have to go back and talk about COVID. and the 4 core lessons that we've learned about COVID. The first one for me, interesting enough, and that is a century of discussion about climate change just helped nothing. This is a harsh statement to make, and I make it based on the fact that if I go back 108 years, I see the first climate change news reporting. Interestingly enough, this news report, I put a copy in here. People say that they will feel the effect of climate change because of emissions in centuries. And this was 108 years ago. But 50 years ago, we saw articles like the tragedy of the Commons, which we all know very well. And there, Gerrit Harden speaks about overconsumption. Also Schumacher, that speaks about overconsumption. Also the Club of Rome, which is 100 years ago, that speaks about overconsumption 50 years ago, and talks about the fact that 100 years from then, which is now 50 years down the line, we can have problems around this. Alan McKinnon, when he spoke about reshoring, and this is what this little icon tells me, and I talk about degrowth, and I'm going to say a lot about degrowth today, and the effect that that's going to have on railways as such. The third lesson for me from COVID is the fact that worldwide we are one organism. We are not distant from each other, but the way in which we are connected is important. And then lastly, when I think about the International Transport Forum, I say that the world leadership position is vacant. Up to recently, we had countries that felt that they lead the world in certain things. Today, we need organizations like the ITF to actually do this. Interestingly for me, the work that's done by the Global Footprint Network that talks about capacity that the world's got and how much of this capacity we spend every year. And now 50 years ago, we ran into a deficit. It's interesting about this as well. Every year, the same Global Footprint, they announce the day in which we have consumed the year's resources. And last year, it was the earliest ever, which was the 29th of July. This year, obviously, for obvious reasons, that's going to be the 22nd of August because of them. And one of the major items of overcapacity is this deficit that we have is obviously emissions. And if you go from emissions and we look at various countries, I look at countries like the USA, that's always been in a deficit since we've had this measurement. And in the world, when we went past this point about 50 years ago, and even China is coming to a deficit in about 40 years from now. It's turning around, but a lot of the countries in the world, like India, etc., is not turning around. I had a look at as well as South America. Now, strangely enough, Brazil and Argentina, for the reasons that we know, some of the countries in the world, there's only a few of them that's not in a deficit yet, but is in a downward trajectory if you look at it. If you talk about trade, and this is where it becomes interesting to me, looking at world trade as a percentage of GDP. And this is the top line there. And we go from a time that we said that trade was the engine of growth. Then eventually about 50 years ago, we say it's the handmaiden of growth. This has turned around. And there's an important point about this in terms of reshoring. We thought that maybe global trade, and the question is asked, to what extent global trade will be affected by this crisis. But if you go back to 1990, since 1990, global trade as a percentage of GDP has been flat. And the other interesting thing that you will see in terms of this, and I call it localization, is since the previous crisis in the world, about a decade ago, global trade as a percentage of GDP has actually never picked up. If I look at it on a regional basis, like for instance, in this case, North America, you will see that this is what I call regionalization. It's happening more and more around the world. If you look at the picture for this, for South America and for China, it's slightly different, but we also see the various actions that's happening in those places has a certain effect. Last thing I want to say about this, we know that we have global trade because the factors of production is cheaper in the developing world. Factors of production in places like Germany, Britain, and Japan is actually became cheaper, whereas it became more expensive in Brazil, South Korea, Poland, etc., and China. This is another thing that shows me that in terms of global trade, it is turning around, and we are becoming a more regional world. The last thing here, if I look at things like gross capital flows, FDI flows, stock of cross-border bank loans, share of countries picking up intermediate imports, all of those things over the last decade is actually gone down. It's not gone up. I think to a large extent what we're going to see with COVID, we're going to see an acceleration of this trend in terms of reshoring. What does this mean for railways? For me, for railways, it means the fact that the first thing that we need to remember, this is what the longest lifespan of transport assets that we get. It's up to 150 years. In fact, we look at mistakes that we've made in South Africa around railway design of 150 years ago, and we still live with that. We still have that problem. What we will see right now is a lot of countries is going to spend money on infrastructure to get things going again around the world. I hope that a lot of that is spent on the right railway infrastructure, of inserting, as I say, railways into the value chains of the world. And this is important for me. The other thing is a lot of these trends will favor it. Things like reshoring and nearshoring will mean that rail transport relative to maritime transport will grow faster. Regionalization will mean that we're going to have longer rail transport routes, for instance, in Southern Africa between the various countries, the Belt and Road between China and its neighbors towards the southeast, and then obviously in South America. And I believe that we will trade more with our neighbors, even things like 3D printing. What we will find is the smaller SKUs will be 3D printed, but the larger SKUs will still be manufactured in central locations and sent around. Even in terms of the way in which we shop online, we're going to find more and more in the future that people will not get overnight or same-day delivery anymore, but we will have a bigger consolidation of freight to regional warehouses where things will be distributed from those regional warehouses. Then I started looking at Argentina. Now, for many of the developing countries around the world, its surface freight ton kilometer as a percentage of the world ton kilometer is much higher than GDP. Argentina's is actually not that much different. Surface freight ton kilometer is a percentage of total ton kilometers in the world, 0.6%. The other thing that I see, and maybe the people from Argentina can tell me more about it, is a relatively large rail network. I don't know to what extent it's maintained, the way it should be maintained, but the fact that it's installed can actually help and can actually make it work. The thing that I can't find, if I read about Argentina, is exactly what is targeted in terms of rail. And I'll say a little bit more about that. It's one thing to say it's this type of commodities, it's this type of work that you want to do, but to what extent will railways enhance the value chains within the country? And I'll come back to that and explain a little bit more about that. What it says to me, rail is not a market. If I look at Theodore Levitt's article of about 60 years ago, 70 years ago, when he talked about marketing myopia, he first used the example of companies that were providing gas for lighting and things like that to the various European countries. And he said, if you believe that you're in a gas market, then you died. Electricity took over. And then he uses the examples of railways. And he says, if you believe you're in a rail market, then you will not make it work. You need to believe that you are on a logistics market. And this is what it's about. You need to insert railways as in value chains. I'll say more about that. But if you think about it, a value chain says you have food and you have people who eat the food. And in between, what happens is this food needs to go to a processing plant. At this processing plant, it becomes the final product. It needs to be sent to a distribution center on the other side, and from there it needs to be sent to retailers. Now, when you think about the railway, you must think about this value chain and how you will insert the railway in that value chain. I'll give you one or two more examples of that. And this value chain is actually the thing that you must consider when you want to consider what the railway must do. And what is the most important tool? If you can find those points of density, that is the major tool of the railway. Now, out about this, I want to spend time about this. I wish I had more time to explain exactly how we found this market spaces, but we believe the railway has got 5 market spaces in which it can compete. One is export mining, where you have massive linkages between internal mines and in the ports. There, railways is very successful in South Africa for iron ore. We run 35,000 ton trains 30,000 trains for 30,000 ton trains for coal. And the export is also the same for the imports. The next one is domestic mining. We have a linkage between your various mines and your manufacturing centers in the country. For South Africa, it will, for instance, be between iron ore mines and places where you make steel. The other one is intermediate manufacturing, where you link up various manufacturing centers. South Africa, that will be a linkage, for instance, between where we make the steel and we move rolled steel to automotive plants. And this usually will be siding to siding traffic. Then you have finished palletized goods. For instance, if it's food, it's a linkage between distribution centers and faraway centers. So you have, in our case, 1,400 kilometers between Durban, between Cape Town and Johannesburg. And there we can put things on pallets. The pallets can go in containers and the containers can go on rail. And this is what we call domestic intermodal. And then you have rural freight. Now, around the world, and especially in the developing world, we find that export mining is high competency. With domestic mining, it's getting better. We're getting more and more minerals back on rail. Intermediate manufacturing, like for instance, my example for steel coils, you connect this with sidings usually. It's usually a siding at the one factory and a siding at the other factory. Finished palletized goods is where you link up distribution centers. We find more and more of this stuff is gone to road. And very, very little of that came back to rail. In Europe, there's a lot of that. With intermodal freight in Europe, domestic is high, and also in America. But in the developing world, where it's needed, like India and China, countries like South America, like Southern Africa, etc., we don't see it. Rural freight is not so high. What's important for me here is, and this is what I was looking for in Argentina, is for each one of these market spaces to actually understand exactly what your market share should be. For South Africa, for instance, we can say it's 93% for export mining phase. It should be 98. There's 5% that needs to be gained. We know it's 7 billion ton kilometers exactly. For domestic mining, the same. For intermediate manufacturing, the same. For finished palletized good as well, and rural freight. We know it's about 30 billion ton kilometers, and we know what that 30 billion should do, but it's small. This is our country. This is compared to the world where there's 32, I think Francisco, it's about 32 trillion ton kilometers overland. But what about India? So we did the same for India, as we did for many countries in which we've done flow modeling. Now for India, this adds up to about 600 billion ton kilometers that we believe could move. In fact, if you only look at India and China, we believe 1 trillion ton kilometers can move from road to rail. It could save the world probably in the region of $200 billion of freight transport costs. And it could, that biocapacity that I spoke about, it could extend the biocapacity that we use every year by about a week, just by doing this, just by going towards where we should go in terms of this. If I take this 5 market spaces for rail, about 40 to 50% is this finished, palletized, long-distance freight between concentrated distribution centers with a service that I call domestic intermodal, where you've inserted the railway inside of this value chain and to make it work in this value chain. And I just use one example. If I look at America, where this is done reasonably successful, this is the growth of GDP for the USA. The red line is the growth of ISO, that is maritime containers, and the blue line is domestic containers. These days, if you were to stop a container on a railway wagon in America, 1 out of 2 of them would be domestic containers. That's never crossed it never crossed a CP. So what does this mean? In terms of emissions reduction roadmap, if you think about rail, I look at rail and I say total freight, if that is 100%, but 80% worldwide, I believe, is on the road, and 37% of that could be reduced. So you can even look at it in terms of kilometers. This is roughly the way in which we've calculated. This is the kilometers that truck drive on the road. About 50% of it's line haul. That's long distance between distribution centers, and about 50% is last mile. 25% of this 50% should shift to rail. That is what's missing on rail. And then there's some other aspects that's also missing. If you add it all together, it's about half of kilometers that's driven by trucks today on the road could actually be eliminated, and 25% of that could come from railways. In fact, we've developed this target, and I'm looking at modal shift, and Alan McKinnon in his presentation spoke about it. He also spoke about the demand side, which we don't have in our roadmap yet, although I'm very, very aware of the demand side, which means that the relative demand for freight should be reduced. This is the supply side where we say, if you have the freight, you have to move it on the road. Around about 15 plus 5 plus 2 plus 4, which is a quarter of the freight, could be taken away from the road and put on rail. It's as simple as that in terms of ton kilometers. The other portion is logistics effectiveness. This is things like driving the truck less by loading it more, and the other one is obviously operational efficiency, including better fuel, better driving methods, etc. The 15% and the 5 and the 2 and the 4 means that if the logistics effectiveness and operational efficiency is at its best, then rail can only contribute 15%. But the best would be to get the full 25% contribution from rail in terms of emissions reduction. Why does this happen? We have poor modal choice because usually we invest incorrectly. Our rail service levels is in a decline. We need to fix that. And this is the reason for road and why it's happening around that. So finally, what does it mean for me? It means that rail can contribute towards sustainability by doing this. Number one, occupy those market spaces that it should. For that, it needs intelligence and information. I realize and I remember when the Minister of Transport, I think of Argentina, spoke about this, spoke about the lack of information. We need very, very specific intelligence to tell us where we should make the shift. And governments and railways should invest in those specific places to make a railway part of a value chain. Make a railway. It is not as if you build a railway that the freight will come. You must design the railway as part of a value chain. There's a difference in thinking about this. And then seamlessly integrate with the other nodes around it. Increase line density. This is the big important thing that you can achieve here. This is the thing that made American railroads work, is by increasing line density and provide natural consolidation of freight. And yeah, God has intended us to fly. He's never given us railways. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Jan.
Thank you very much, Jan.
Súper interesante
That was so
intervención. Me
interesting.
quedo con la idea de que, bueno,
I
post-COVID o el
take the
COVID nos ha
message
traído algunas
that
tendencias
COVID
en
has
logística
given
que pueden llegar a ser
in
favorables para
logistics
el
that could
ferrocarril.
be favorable
Si les
for
parece, pasamos
railways.
al
We will
siguiente
now go
panelista.
to the next
Es
panelist,
Jorge Kogan.
which is
Jorge es un
Kogan.
consultor independiente
Jorge
con más
is
de
an
40 años de
independent
experiencia
consultant with
el área
over
de
40
transporte e
years
infraestructura. Durante
experience in
15 años
transport
fue
infrastructure
consejero senior
fields.
de
For 15 years,
infraestructura
he
en
was the
CAF,
senior
Banco de
advisor
Desarrollo de América
at
Latina,
CAF, the
donde lideró el
Development
grupo de
Bank of Latin
transportes.
America, where he headed the
Previo a
transport
ocupar
group.
ese
Prior to
cargo,
that,
Jorge Kogan fue secretario de Transporte de
Jorge
Argentina
Kogan was the
de
Secretary of Transport
1999 a
of
2001.
Argentina from 1999
Entre
to
otros proyectos,
2001,
durante
and
su
among
carrera
other
participó
projects,
activamente en
he
reformas
spearheaded
del
reforms
sector ferroviario y sistemas
in
de
the
metro en varios
railways and
países
subways of
de
various
América
Latin
Latina y
American
también en
countries,
Polonia.
as well as
Jorge Kogan es
Poland.
ingeniero de la Universidad de Buenos
He
Aires,
is an
tiene
engineer,
un diploma de
graduated from the
Ingeniería
University
Civil
of
del
Buenos
Imperial
Aires. He
College
holds a
y
diploma of
también
civil
un máster en
engineering from
transporte
the
de la
Imperial
Universidad de
College
Londres.
and an MSc
Sin
in
más,
transport from the University
bienvenido
of London.
Jorge. Adelante.
Welcome, Jorge. Hello, good morning, everybody who is here on this side of the Atlantic. Good afternoon to people who are on the other side. Thank you to the International Transport Forum for asking me to participate in this seminar. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Julieta, for your introduction. I will focus on this part of the meeting in describing the railways in Argentina, a summary, And a reference about Latin America, the reason why I will focus on Argentina more than in Latin America is that one of the participants, Jorge Kohn, will actually speak more specifically about Latin America, and we can save time. Let us see that in the context of this presentation, why we will try to understand the situation of railways, taking into account the reduction of emissions, which is the target of this project. There are probably some participants who have not attended our previous sessions. Transport represents approximately 4% of GDP, and it is responsible for 15% of total emissions of the country, so around 54 million tons of CO2 equivalent. 90% of the emissions come from road transport, and out of these 90%, half, 45%, are trucks. 39% are automobiles, and 6% is other vehicles that use the roadways. Railways are responsible for 0.3% of those emissions, and we will see why we have such a low figure. When it comes to the plans that the state carried out to face this reduction and the commitments according to the Paris Agreement, the reduction of emissions of the sector should be 60% through load transport, and half of that, 30%, out of the derivation from the truck to the railways. This is the proposal of the National Plan for Climate Change and Transport. The mechanisms that we were going to use for this to derive, to defer load from trucks to railways, we needed to modernize and rehabilitate different rolling stock, and also to be able to have general container loads. And this was properly addressed by Jan before, and we would love to have Argentine railways to have the traffic that he was describing. But in order to achieve this, besides from the railway network, we need to have investment and a transfer center hub to be able to facilitate access to ports. And this can make so that through intermodality, you can actually transfer the load from one system to the other. What is the role of railways in the internal loading? It's just 3.5% of what is transported, about 18 million tons. These figures are from last year. And now it'll probably be 2 more tons, but it's about 20 million tons total out of 530 million tons total. You can see that 92% is done by automotive transport, and by water 3.6%. If we measure it with regards to traffic, which is more descriptive when it comes to each mode of transport, we can see that the total of automotive transport is 88%, railways 4%, and water through the waterways is 8%. It goes up a bit, but total for railways is 8 million tons. The average distance that the railway goes is 428 kilometers, whether by water is 871, and by roadway is 361 kilometers. The average distance that the freight goes through. How is the operational organization of freight railways in Argentina? Half the system is dealt with by three private concessionaires that have had it from 91 92. They operate half of the network, 8,818 kilometers. These concessions, when it finish their contracts in 22 and 21 next year. So that is something that we will speak about again. And then the other 9,000 kilometers is operated by Belgrano Cargas and Logistics, which is a state company, which includes different types of railways. And they have different combinations of ownership, private and public, but it is always within the state, and then other different ones that have been used and they failed in the private sector. When it comes to the operation of the public and private, which is, but over 75% of the total whole is moved by private companies, transported by private companies. This has been controversies around this. The operational network has gone down. In 1957, we had 44,000 kilometers, which is around what the state received when these were nationalized 10 years before that date. And the Argentine railway system was the most extended in the whole of Latin America, and one of the first ones that began construction in the middle of the 19th century. Now we only have 18,000 kilometers, and for the time where in 1989, the state had 10,000 kilometers less, 34,000 kilometers were concessioned in 5 networks, except for Ferrocarril Belgrano, which remained in the state. So it left us with that figure. Nevertheless, we have less than 18,000 kilometers in use at the moment. And to finish with the description, if you took a picture, the average speed of railways is no more than a third of comparable railways of the countries that used to have the same extended railway, Brazil, Mexico, or Canada. The poor level of investment that we have had and the maintenance expense is less than a third of what they invest in railways that work properly elsewhere. Let's see what happened with traffic and the comments that I was making with regards to the extension of the network. When the network used to work at its maximum expression by one state company, Ferrocarriles Argentina, in 1965, 14,000 tons were moved per kilometer of railway. This happened until the beginning of the 80s, and then there is a substantial drop with very few reductions of the extension of the network, so that in 1990, a fourth of what was transported before was transported by then. So when it came to concessions afterwards, which happened from 91 and 92, and through the improvement of efficiencies that this private sector gave, the freight begins to go up. There is a problem in 2008 because of the financial crisis, and with the failure of the two concessions that I mentioned before, there is another drop in traffic in 2014-15, and now it is slowly recovering. It will have similar values to 30, 40 years ago, but the network is a third of what it used to be. So we have here the first conclusion, and not necessarily like many romantics try to explain, the reduction of rail traffic has to do with the cut of the utilization of that network. And that is the discussion that takes us to what Jan said with regards to the importance of investment. If we look at the evolution of the private sectors, the ones in yellow, we see the growth that you can achieve compared to the state operation of these networks, which is the blue one. the Belgrano line, and then we have the other two lines that you can see there, the orange and the gray. We're not trying to issue a judgment about the state and the private sector, but we're just showing the figures and the capability of managing of these companies when it comes to private or public companies. Uh, the state has had this Belgrano line since 91. So the diagnosis for the current situation in the first place in Argentina, and I am not speaking about the present situation, but this diagnosis describes the last 15 years of railways. There is clearly an institutional weakness, a very low level of organization. It is disorganized. The governance and the management is confusing. There is a limited professional resource pool in the control organizations and in the planning and management sectors of railways. So there is very little quality planning. Public policies are inconsistent, uncoordinated when it comes to intermodal, intersectorial, and interjurisdictional issues. There is very little production of information, especially the information that we need to be able to evaluate policies and projects. If you can see the projects that they have been executing in the sector in the last few years, we can see that most of them have been projects without any backup. They're disconnected, they're not prioritized, and this takes us inevitably to a level of service which is very inefficient, with very little uh, market share, and constantly declining beyond any improvements that we may generate in the system. In these conditions, it is very difficult to have quality service, and this comment has to do with this goal that the state has with regards of absorbing part of the transport of goods from trucks. The consequences means that we have an enormous mosaic of situations which are unfavorable. Many times the technical operational safety rules are not adhered to due to confusion and lack of control. The level of investment and maintenance is very poor. The investment is very low. And we have a system, Jan spoke about this, it is a great extension, low scale, low volume, and very low haul density. We normally transport grain and construction material on the railways. The state of the network is regular or bad, except for some improved uh, bits of track in Belgrano due to some credits that they have had from the CAF, for example. And although they have invested in some specific network places, because it is not the whole network, the difficulty is insufficient because there are still some areas of the railway that are very bad. Uh, the, the, the investments are not enough even to be able to keep the tracks in the minimum state that they should be kept. This whole situation takes us to doubt with regards to the capacity that the railways may have to absorb the uh, the transport that the government has asked with regards to the climate change. What is the future of the system? It is clear that to be able to move the load from trucks to rails, you'd need a complete change and an improvement of quality of service. The low participation of the railways is not only to do with efficiency, but it is also because in Argentina, we have a geographic and productive structure that doesn't make it viable for it to have railways with density and efficiency levels that are needed for this to be viable. The original network of 44,000 kilometers was efficacious because there was no road transport. Once the road transport went up, the the network reduced itself, and now between the operational networks, 85 or 95% of the freight is moved using only 55 and 70% of the available, so even less than the 18,000 kilometers that are currently operational. Most of the extended railways that are successful now have had the movement, the transport of mining materials. You can see this in Canada, which is 56% of traffic. Half of it is mining. In the US, 43% of the traffic, a third is mining. In Australia, 80% of the mining goes through the railways. And in Brazil, in South America, it is the most extended and most share of the transport is done. 80% is mining and construction building materials. It is estimated that the rise in load in freight would be about 55 million tons in Argentina. This was made with a feasibility study of the freight that was done by the Ministry of Transport recently. And if the railways could have optimum conditions for service, you could add another 20 to 30 million tons a year. When you study where this traffic, this excessive traffic would go, you could see that 95% of this traffic could be taken by the 50% of the operational network. So no more than 10,000 kilometers of the network, if you could move the traffic from the road to the railways, and you could capture these levels and these volumes that I just described, I insist, 95% of the traffic would only use the 10,000 kilometers of railway, and they would have the density levels that Jan was describing in his presentation. What are the challenges for the railways in Argentina? In the first place, the governance needs to be organized. If there's not an institutionally organized sector, it is very difficult if the state doesn't come into it when it comes to organization and operation and the traffic that the railway may be able to carry. We have to go towards this derivation of the National Plan for Climate Change, which is to triple the amount of freight that goes on the railway and go from 4% to 15% in the system. In order to do this, we need investment to be able to rehabilitate the system, refurbish it, and advance towards its consolidation. We have some works by the 50% of the operational network, areas of the network, and this has not changed operations much. But beyond the crisis that is currently affecting us, not only the pandemic, but also the economic crisis that this will have for the next 10 years, we estimate that we would need investments of around 10 or $15,000 to be able to develop this. It is important to coordinate rail policies that include all services that are in charge of the state within the framework of a sectorial policy of transport that is integral and realistic. Besides from the fact that we're focusing on reducing emissions on freight railway to resolve this part of the reduction and the commitment that Argentina has made, the state also operates passenger services in the city of Buenos Aires, long-haul passenger service, and this not only distracts attention from the few resources, financial or professional, that the state has available, but it also may produce a contradictory result when it comes to emissions. What I mean is that emissions may be reduced if we take and transport things instead of trucks on the railways. But if the state gives more long-haul passenger service in trains that take less passengers uh, that you would need from a bus service, when you have a train, even with just two wagons, you can see that there is a lot of emissions. So in a way, we would be reducing emission when it comes to freight, but we would probably rise emissions if we transport passengers from the road to the railways with services that are pretty inefficient, not profitable, and require enormous effort from the state in time and in investment and in management. In order for you to get an idea of why I'm making this comment is that in long distance buses and regional services, 70 million passengers use it. The railway only has 1 million passengers a year. It is a very small figure to have such big investments that are not necessarily helping the quality of the service. There's so many things that we are left and we have uncertainty. We don't know what the management model will be, especially since the drafting of law 27,132, which is the open access law. This is not clear that this is a debate and a deepening that of this knowledge will be necessary. And in the midst of all this, we will need to define the future of the concessioned networks, which will finish their first phase of the contract in 2021 and 22. And although we forecast that we could be extended for 10 more years, we don't know whether that extension will be enough to have the necessary investment uh, when to be able to get back your investment within that time, because it takes about 40 years to get it back. So the state will have to make decisions to be able to orient the future of railways. And we need, once this is done, there is to be a regulatory framework that stimulates a model of competition so the transport costs can go down, business may be efficient and profitable, and especially to structure the transport of bulk products, which is the objective that the railways have always had, and to strengthen the transport of general freight, especially containerized, so we can also have investment in hubs, in access to ports, so that the system can work more efficiently and we can achieve the reduction of the emissions that we have committed to. When it comes to the situation of railways in Latin America, as I said, um, Jorge will speak more deeply about this, but this was my mission, so I wanted to say something about it. We can see some basic data. Some may be a bit out of date about the different rail networks in Latin America, and we can just highlight that countries such as Mexico, Brazil, who are the leaders in Latin America, plus Panama and Colombia, have rail networks that have a important participation of 20% more when it comes to the freight movement transport. The other countries have a more reduced network. They try to survive. In Latin America, there is 35 railway companies, but 80% of these are private. And in most countries, they are working relatively well. There is a paradox. Argentina was the first country to begin with concessions. It was the leader. It helped other countries to generate similar systems. But when everything worked fine in the other countries. In Argentina, although we haven't completely failed, we have not been able to produce the results that were expected. And this is a discussion that we must have to understand what our failures have been on the side of the companies and some companies and the government. Also, in the railways of the rest of Latin America, it is important to change the culture of mass traffic to general freight, and with the necessary investment, give access to ports and to hubs to be able to achieve that. With a greater participation of the railways, these countries may also manage to reduce emissions, just like Argentina is trying to do. Thank you so much. I am here finished. I'm sorry that I took a bit more time than was needed.
Muchas gracias, Jorge.
Thank you, Jorge.
Súper interesante la
The
presentación. Me
presentation was
quedo
so interesting.
Bueno, un poco con la palabra incertidumbre, ¿no?
Here,
Digamos, con algunas
the
preguntas. En la gestión
uncertainty is
anterior
what really spoke
entramos
to
en esta
me.
crisis y todavía
We
hay
have gone into this
indefinición
crisis,
en lo
and
que
there's
es
still
el marco
lack of
regulatorio
definition
en un
when it
sector
comes
que
to
ya
the
venía bastante
regulatory
castigado,
framework
como era el transporte
in a
ferroviario de carga.
sector
También me
that
quedo
was
con el
already
gráfico
doing
bastante
badly.
ilustrativo de las
And
ventajas comparativas de
when you
los
spoke about the
operadores
comparative
privados
advantages
respecto de
of
los
the
públicos, y bueno,
private
en el
against
mundo de lo
the
privado,
state,
la palabra incertidumbre
in the private sector, the word
genera problemas en lo
uncertainty
que es la visión
generates problems when
de
it comes
futuro
to
del sector.
thinking about the future of the sector.
Pasamos, si te
We
parece,
will now
Francisco,
go, Francisco, to
al
our
siguiente
next speaker,
expositor, a Alejandro Álvarez
Alejandro
Reyes,
Álvarez Reyes.
que es desde 2018 titular de la
Since
Agencia Reguladora de
2018, he
Transporte
is the head of the
Ferroviario
Rail
de la
Regulatory
Secretaría de
Agency
Comunicaciones
of
y
the
Transportes
Secretariat of
de México.
Communications and
Su
Transportation of
experiencia en
Mexico.
transporte y
His
gestión de proyectos,
experience in
particularmente en transporte ferroviario,
transport
se
and
extiende
project
a lo largo de
management,
casi
especially
20
in
años.
railways, extends over
Entre otras
almost
actividades,
20
hizo
years. Among
investigación
other
en ingeniería
activities,
de vías
he
férreas
researched
en
rail
Railtech, el mayor
engineering at
centro de
Railtech, the
investigación ferroviaria en
largest
América
rail
del Norte.
research center
Es
in North
también profesor
America. He's
asociado
also an
en la
associate
Facultad de
lecturer at the
Ingeniería de la
Faculty of
Universidad Nacional
Engineering of the National
Autónoma de
Autonomous
México, la UNAM.
University of
El
Mexico, the
señor Álvarez Reyes es
UNAM.
ingeniero
Mr.
civil
Álvarez
de la
Reyes
UNAM
is a
y tiene
civil
una maestría en
engineer from the
transporte e
UNAM and has an
ingeniería
MSc
ferroviaria
in
de
transport
la
and railway
Universidad
engineering
de
from the
Illinois
University
at
of Illinois at
Urbana-Champaign.
Urbana-Champaign.
Alejandro.
Alejandro.
Muchísimas gracias por la introducción, Julieta, y mi agradecimiento al ITF por la
Thank you so
invitación,
much for
a Francisco
your
Furtado y a Stephen
invitation to
Perkins
Francisco
que se
Furtado
propuso participar, y lo hago
and
con mucho gusto.
to the invitation.
Les
I'm
voy
so
a
happy to be
compartir
here. I'm going
mi
to share
presentación.
my presentation.
Les preparé la presentación en inglés, la voy a ir comentando en español.
Give it in Spanish.
Inicio aquí es una presentación
It is a presentation
muy concentrada.
that is very
La idea
focused.
es compartir
The idea is to share
un resumen de cómo es el sector
a
ferroviario en
summary
México,
of the rail
empezando por la descripción
situation in
de
Mexico.
la red ferroviaria, algunos números
We
de
will speak
estadística básica,
about some facts
cómo
and
funciona este
figures,
esquema que ya
some
Jorge
scheme
Kogan
and regulations
compartió
that
algunos
Jorge Kogan
aspectos de
has
cómo
already
ha funcionado
spoken
y
about,
la historia
some
reciente,
how it worked
una
in
fotografía
recent
de la
history,
situación actual,
a picture of the
los
current
retos
situation,
principales
the
que
challenges
encontramos ahora en el
that we
sector
find in the sector,
alguna perspectiva o
and a
perspectiva de hacia
perspective
dónde se dirige este
of
sector en México.
the path forward
Empiezo
in Mexico.
con la
I will
descripción de la
begin
red. En
describing the
efecto,
network.
tenemos en
We do
total
have
casi 27,000 kilómetros.
about
Voy de abajo hacia arriba,
27,000
desde
kilometers.
que por distintas razones
For different
tenemos más o
reasons,
menos
for various
3,500 fuera
reasons,
de
we have about
operación. Esta red se
3,500 that are
construyó en
out of
distintos lugares del
operation.
mundo a finales del siglo
at the
XIX
end of
y principios del XX.
this was built at the beginning of the
También es
20th
interesante que esta
century,
red
and it
nunca
is
estuvo
important
realmente muy
to
sobredimensionada, es una red
note that
básicamente troncal, hay
it
pocas
is a
líneas
trunk
alimentadoras, ¿no?
it is a
La
trunk-like
revolución en México,
network.
entonces eso, aunque venía
When we
en
had
un
the
ritmo de
revolution,
expansión muy fuerte, la
it had a
revolución
very strong
contuvo
pace of
el crecimiento,
extension,
inclusive
and
destruyó
it had the
bastante la
growth
infraestructura,
and the
pero
infrastructure,
le dio este carácter que
and it
como
gave
sucedió en otros
it
lugares del mundo, ¿no? Que las redes
this
crecieron
particular
muchísimo,
nature.
inclusive a nivel de estar sobredimensionadas, y la de México
It was a bit
logró una
too
muy
much.
buena
In
cobertura,
Mexico, we had very
que
good
es muy
coverage,
parecida
which is
y se ha
quite
mantenido
similar
estable a lo largo del tiempo, ¿no?
and is
Tenemos
stable throughout the years.
17,000
We
kilómetros
have
de
about
vía principal y
17,000
secundaria
of
concesionada,
main and secondary track that are
4,500
concession,
kilómetros de vía
4,500 of
auxiliar y
auxiliary
1,500
track,
de vías
and
particulares.
1,500 of private track.
En el caso de transporte de carga tenemos
When it comes to
básicamente
freight
7
transport, we have
empresas
7
concesionarias,
companies that are concessions,
digamos 3 muy
concessionaires,
grandes, ¿no?
3 that
Que
are very
son
big,
dos concesiones bajo control del
2
Grupo México
concessions
Transportes,
under
este
Grupo
conglomerado que
México
participa
Transportes.
de manera muy importante en minería,
They
y
are
también en
very
este segundo
much
componente
connected
en
to mining.
transporte. Tenemos una
We have
subsidiaria del Kansas City
a
Southern
subsidiary of Kansas
tiene, digamos,
City
la segunda
Southern,
red en
which has the
tamaño.
second network when
Después
it comes to
viene el
size.
Ferrocarril del Istmo, que es una
Then we
empresa
have
paraestatal
Ferrocarril
que
del
opera
Istmo,
en
which is
el
a
sureste del país,
part
porque,
state, and
digamos,
it operates in the
se ha
southeast of the
mantenido en esta
country,
condición,
and it has been
digamos,
kept in
el
this
sureste del país
condition.
tiene
The
bajo desarrollo
southeast of the
industrial.
country has
Ahora
a
hay
low
una serie de
industrial
planes para
development,
revertir esa situación y equilibrar un poco más las
and
cosas con el centro y el
we
norte.
are
Después un
trying to
ferrocarril
improve that
regional
and make it
en
more
el norte del
balanced to the
país, que
north.
tiene
Then we have
básicamente dos líneas que
Coahuila
atienden
Durango,
minería
which has 2 lines with
y
mining
productos
and
metálicos, una terminal para
metal
servir el
products.
mercado del Valle de México y una pequeña línea
And then we
desconectada
have a
en el estado de
small
Baja California.
disconnected in
En
the state
efecto,
of Baja
tenemos del
California,
orden de
and we have
128
about
millones de toneladas netas, algo como
128
en toneladas
net
kilómetro,
tons
89
per
mil millones,
kilometers.
como comentaba Jorge Kogan.
As Jorge
En efecto,
Kogan was saying,
nuestra reparto modal
in
de
effect,
transporte terrestre
our
es
modal
75 camiones,
is
25
75
ferrocarril,
for
y
road
una
and
muy
trucks,
clara
and
vocación
25% for
del sistema
railway,
ferroviario
and a
al
clear
transporte internacional, ¿no?
indication.
A través de los puertos
We
y las
use the
fronteras, ¿no? Tenemos
ports.
muy buena conectividad,
We have
tenemos
a
8
very good
puertos fronterizos,
connectivity. We have
7 en el norte, uno en el sur, que está por
8 border
rehabilitarse,
crossings,
y acceso a los
7
12 puertos
north and 1
principales del
at the
país.
south, and access to 12 main
En cuanto al
ports in
esquema
the
y la
country.
regulación,
When it comes
venimos,
to
digamos,
regulation
la
and the scheme,
construcción empezó con concesiones privadas que
building
pasaron a
began with
formar
private
una
concessions, and they
compañía
became
nacional que operó,
a national
digamos,
company
poco menos de 90 años, ¿no?
in
Por ahí un hito
little
importante
less
en
than 90
1937, donde
years,
se
from
nacionalizaron.
1908 to
Y bueno,
1995, when they were nationalized.
arrastraba una serie de
And it
problemas,
had
y en
a few
1995 se
problems.
inició una
And in
reestructuración completa,
1995,
después de
there was a
reconsiderar
complete
el modelo
restructuring
europeo y el modelo
with the
norteamericano, que pues
European
era
and the
referencia
American
por la
model,
importante
which were used as
conectividad que hay con las
reference
redes de
for
Canadá
the
y Estados
important
Unidos. Se
connectivity
decidió
to
por algo
the
más
United
inspirado en el
States and
modelo
Canada.
norteamericano, que es el
So
modelo
we
sin perder
wanted
el
to be
control del
inspired more
Estado.
in the North American, but
Entonces
without
se
losing the
establecieron
state control on
concesiones
this.
integradas verticalmente con
Concessions
poder de
were
mercado
vertically
regional.
integrated with a
Este
regional market
proceso,
power.
en términos generales,
This
ha sido muy
process
exitoso, ¿no? Los
has been very
principales objetivos se han
successful so
cumplido.
far. Main objectives
Hay
were met.
progreso muy importante en
There
muchos
is
temas,
significant progress
sin que
in
esto
many
signifique que no
issues,
haya asignaturas pendientes
but
por
of
retos
course we have
importantes, ¿no?
challenges still ahead.
Probablemente el más destacado,
The
o
most
los dos más
important of
destacados, yo diría
these, or the
que
two
ha
most
habido
important of
inversiones
these,
en estos
is that
23
there's
años que ha
been
operado este
investment in these
esquema de
23 years of
$8,500 millones para una
$8,500
situación
million
de muy altos subsidios, ¿no? Subsidios del
with
orden de
very
$500
high
millones por
subsidies,
año que recibía
$500 million
la compañía
subsidy
nacional.
per year.
En estos 23 años el
And in
tráfico
these
ha
23 years,
evolucionado
the traffic
justamente
has
de 40
evolved
mil millones de toneladas
from
kilómetro a prácticamente
14,000
90 mil, ¿no?
kilometers
Más del doble.
per kilometer
En
to be
2015 hubo
doubled.
una
In
reforma
2015,
adicional
there
de
was a
menos
reform,
calado, ¿no? Digamos un
uh,
ejercicio de
an
refinamiento, de
exercise of
revisión que
refining,
se debía
reviewing,
fortalecer.
for
Esto creó la
strengthening,
Agencia
and
Reguladora
this
del Transporte
created
Ferroviario, que tengo el
the
honor de encabezar.
agency for railway
tenemos a
services,
cargo
which I
los deberes de
head.
la regulación económica
Our
y
duties have
técnica,
to do with the
los
technical and
temas de
economic
seguridad
regulation,
operativa,
safety in
verificaciones,
operations,
inspecciones, el registro de
inspections,
todas las concesiones y todos los elementos
doing all
alrededor,
the
y
reporting
la
and
vigilancia del
logging,
cumplimiento de la ley
and
específica
the
en la
rail law
materia.
enforcement.
En el caso de regulación económica
When it comes
es
to
un
economic
proceso
regulation,
peculiar, ¿no?
this is a
Tiene dos
peculiar
partes. Una primera,
process. It has two
un órgano
parts.
constitucional
One
autónomo
is to do with an
inicia una
autonomous
investigación y
organization that
decreta
initiates an
condiciones
investigation,
de falta de competencia, y eso
and
detona la
then
intervención de la agencia como
there is
regulador
an
sectorial,
intervention by
y
the
esto
agency,
lo vemos, ¿no?
and we see this.
Obviamente participan las fuerzas del mercado, entonces se
Obviously,
trata de
market
intervenciones
forces
excepcionales, ¿no? De
participate,
hecho,
so
estamos
these are
a unos días de emitir la primera
interventions that
resolución
happen.
en ese
We
sentido,
will
¿no?
have
De
a
la creación de la
discussion in the
agencia,
next
que va a
few days
cumplir
with regards to this in
4
the
años.
agency.
Digamos un poco una fotografía actual.
This is the current
Digamos
situation.
aquí el tema principal es carga. Digamos, son dos
When we
historias
talk about
totalmente
freight,
distintas,
two
y lo que ha
separate
generado un
issues here.
enorme desbalance entre lo que sucede
There's
con carga
an
y lo que
imbalance
sucede con
between
pasajeros, ¿no?
freight and
En carga hay
passengers.
un progreso muy significativo,
Freight
como
has
ya
had
comenté, y
significant
en pasajeros,
progress,
como parte del
and
proceso
in
de
passenger, because
reestructuración, era,
the
digamos,
process of restructuring
la modalidad que recibía mayores
was the
subsidios.
modality that
Entonces,
got
había
more
una
subsidies.
política importante contra ese esquema. Entonces, ya venía
So there
muy
was a
deteriorado
policy
el servicio
against
de
this.
pasajeros,
The
y
passenger
cuando se
services
reestructuró
were
se
very
canceló
deteriorated,
definitivamente, ¿no? Y eso nos
and
dejó
it was
como
pretty
una
much
línea
canceled.
suburbana y un
We
par
have a
de
suburban
servicios turísticos, ¿no?
rail and just
Pasajeros
tourist
estamos
services.
prácticamente en cero.
Passenger services is pretty much
Los
zero.
volúmenes han crecido a un ritmo superior
The
al Producto
volumes have
Interno
been
Bruto.
growing at a higher rate than GDP.
Los primeros años de la
The first few
reestructuración,
years of
el
restructuring,
ferrocarril, digamos,
the
con todo el cambio que
railway,
implicó,
with
ganó
all the
mucho terreno al
change
autotransporte en los
that
primeros
meant
10, 12 años,
the
y esta
transport by
situación de
road has been going up,
75-25 se ha
and this
mantenido
situation of
en los últimos
75-25
10
has
meses,
been
uno
maintained
de
in the
los
last
retos
10 years.
importantes. Como comentaba, el comercio internacional es
The
la vocación
international
principal, ¿no?
trade is
con
the
algo alrededor del
main
70%
vocation of
o
the
inclusive
Mexican rail
más del
system.
transporte ferroviario en México es para
40%
comercio, está
of
asociado al
our
comercio
transport
internacional.
has to do with international
Y
trade.
bueno, producto de esta
And
interconexión que
product
forma en
segments,
realidad
because
un
of this
sistema, ¿no?
connectivity that we
Desde
have,
esa
which
visión
is a system,
más completa, funciona muy
it
bien
works
en esta
very well
interconexión con Estados Unidos y Canadá,
in this
y por
connection
lo
with
tanto
Canada
el
and the
tema de
US.
tarifas, ¿no? Que se
And
ve aquí,
therefore, when it comes to,
desde 1960,
you can see here from
andaban también,
1960,
hay el cambio regulatorio en 80 en Estados
the
Unidos, y a partir
regulatory
de eso en México
change in
tarifas empiezan a ir a
1980
la
in the
alza,
States
¿no?
and Mexico.
En verde se
You
representa
can
con
see
la parte
in
de
green
subsidios y pérdidas. Y después
subsidies
está
and
marcado el hito
losses,
de la
and
reestructuración,
then you
donde
can
las
see the
tarifas ya empiezan a tener
restructuring
un
where the
comportamiento mucho más
tariffs
cercano
have
a lo que sucede
a
en el resto de
more
Norteamérica, ¿no? Aquí
comparable
en
to the
la
rest of
otra
North
gráfica, que
America.
espero
In the
alcancen a
other
ver,
graph
esta
that
quedó
you
un
can
poco
see
apretada,
here,
también lo que comentaba
you can see
Jorge Kogan, ¿no? La vocación
with
principal
what
son
Jorge
productos
Kogan was
industriales, ¿no?
saying,
Ahí
we have industrial products come
los
first,
automóviles, las autopartes,
cars,
los
car
contenedores, los bienes de
parts,
consumo han sido estos tráficos que han ido
consumer
tomando un
goods
papel cada vez más relevante, ¿no?
are
La
more
industria
and more
automotriz
relevant.
ha sido en buena medida con la instalación de
That
muchas
has been,
plantas responsable de esto.
there's a
El
lot of
segundo
plants that
grupo,
we
los
service.
productos
Then
agrícolas,
we
¿no?
have
En la parte
agricultural
norte y
products
centro del país,
in
mucha
the north and the
importación
center of the country,
de
a lot of
granos.
import of grain.
También el rubro del
Also,
petróleo,
oil.
perdón, los minerales primero, también
Sorry,
con una
first
participación
minerals
importante, y
have an
después
important share,
el petróleo, que también ha sido de esos
and
tráficos que
then
ha venido
oil,
creciendo, también por
which
la
has been
apertura en el
growing
mercado energético, ¿no? Que
in the
es
energy
relativamente
market.
reciente.
That's pretty recent.
En cuanto a los retos,
When it
como
comes to the
les decía,
challenges ahead,
tenemos
as I
en
was
términos de
saying,
pasajeros una
when it
línea
comes to passenger service, we have one
suburbana y dos
commuter
servicios
line and
turísticos.
two
En
tourist
la competencia con
services.
el autotransporte,
Competition
sobre todo
against
esto
road
ha venido
transportation
cambiando
is
muy recientemente.
has changed
Podemos hablar que no
recently.
hay piso parejo, ¿no? Como
it
decimos
is
en México,
uneven ground, as we
porque
say in
el
Mexico,
autotransporte
because
tiene
the road transport
condiciones, por
has
ejemplo, incentivos fiscales que en algún momento tuvo el ferrocarril, ya
tax
no los tiene.
incentives that the rail used to have and no longer
Digamos,
has.
por su naturaleza, pues hay una serie
Due
de
to its
subsidios,
nature,
digamos,
there is a
ocultos
series of
en
subsidies which
el
are hidden
mantenimiento de la infraestructura
in the
carretera.
maintenance of the road
Tenemos que ya se está combatiendo muy eficientemente
transport network.
teníamos un grave problema
We used
de
to have
combustible ilegal, empieza
a
a
very,
reducirse de
very
forma
big problem
importante.
with
Y
regards to
si
illegal
juntamos todos estos
fuel.
factores, ¿no?
And if we put all these factors
Empresas de
together,
transporte informales, pues se vuelve
and
una competencia
informal
desleal, ¿no?
transport companies,
contra el ferrocarril.
it is really unfair
En términos de densidad de
competition.
tráfico,
When it
ahora
comes to
veía yo
density of
los números
traffic,
contra Brasil que
you've
presentó
seen
Economies y es realmente uno de los retos importantes, ¿no? Tenemos una muy
one
buena
of
red
our
a la que se le ha
challenges is
invertido
we have a
de manera muy
fantastic
importante
network.
en
We
los
have
últimos años,
invested a
tiene muy
lot in
buena
it in the last few
capacidad,
years. We have
pero no
great
llegamos a la
capability, but we
densidad del
cannot
tráfico
have
que
the density of
Estados Unidos o
traffic
Brasil, ¿no? Ahí tenemos un
of the
espacio
States or
para
Brazil.
mejorar, para que tomara
So
más
there's
volumen.
room for
También las
improvement there.
terminales,
And the
digamos que la red
terminals
ahora
of
está
the
en una mejor
network
condición que las terminales, ¿no?
are
Para
in a better
permitir
condition.
captar
The rail
más
network is better
tráfico.
than the terminals
Desde el
to
punto
be
de vista
able
de
to
nosotros como
capture more
regulador
traffic.
sectorial,
As
pues hemos estado trabajando
regulators,
en
we have
desarrollar
been
mejor
working in
acceso a la
the better
información del
development
sistema,
of
¿no? Para
access
poder
to
ejercer mejor
information in the
regulación.
system.
Ahora publicamos un nuevo
We
sistema de
published a
indicadores
new
ferroviarios.
system of
También
indicators for
estamos trabajando muy
railways, and we're
fuerte en la
also working
consolidación de este
in
organismo que, como decía,
consolidating
se
this
creó hace 4 años.
organization
Tenemos muchas
that was
herramientas
created 4 years ago. We
regulatorias
have many
que
regulatory
todavía están en
tools
desarrollo,
that are
¿no?
still in development
Asesorar ese proceso. Hemos
to be
contado ahí
able to
con la
aid that
OECD y
process
el ITF en
with the
particular.
OECD
Estas herramientas son
and
básicamente
the
un modelo de red que
ITF.
pueda
This is
ver la
a
película completa con el
network model, so you can
autotransporte.
see the whole
Ahora,
transport
y sobre todo en el contexto de contingencia
perspective,
sanitaria, muchas
especially
limitaciones
in
de
this
presupuesto.
health
Y
crisis.
digamos
We
que uno de
have
los
budget
retos
constraints, and one
más
of
en
the
la parte económica
challenges
es
when it
el
comes
esquema de
to
derechos de paso, que
finance
es
is
básicamente
the
el
short
acceso
trackage rights, which
de
is
una empresa
the
ferroviaria al territorio
access
de la
of
otra
one
con
railway
su
company to
equipo y
the
sus
other
tripulaciones.
territory, to the other company.
Hay muchos derechos de
There
paso
is a lot
establecidos
of
cortos, ¿no? Que,
trackage rights that are
es
short
de las partes que no han terminado de funcionar del todo. Ahí hay
in
un
areas where they
reto
haven't been able to
importante
completely cover it. There is an
para
important
abrir un poco
challenge
más
ahead with that, and
el
to
acceso a
open
más empresas
the
que
access
muevan
to
su carga por
more
ferrocarril y generar también competencia sana.
companies to transport, and also to
En
have
la
healthy
parte
competition.
prospectiva,
When it comes to
estamos
the path forward
desde la Administración Federal
from the
promoviendo y en
federal
el desarrollo de un
administration, we are
estudio
promoting
de largo
and
plazo, ¿no? Con
developing a
una proyección a
prospective study,
50
a
años, un
long-term
estudio de
one
gran
for
visión,
50 years.
cuyos dos objetivos
And the
principales
both main objectives of this study
reconocemos como muy ambiciosos,
that we recognize are
pero
very
tenemos que ir en esa
ambitious,
dirección,
but
es que
we
la
need to go in that
participación en
direction,
el
is that
transporte
the
terrestre del
share
ferrocarril aumente al
for
40%,
rail should go up by
retomar de manera
40%
consistente el servicio de
to
pasajeros, ¿no?
get back
Pensando
a passenger service,
proyectos escalables, ¿no? Que vayan
considering a
formando
scalable,
una red y que sean
interoperable network
interoperables, ¿no? A través de proyectos pequeños y
through
medianos, y ahí pongo el
medium
asterisco
and
con la
size
diferencia
and small size
que esta
projects. And
administración,
the
como decía yo,
asterisk
ha
I
puesto
put there
un
is this
muy especial
administration
énfasis y
has
atención en el sureste, y
put
ahí
the
tenemos un
accent on the
megaproyecto
southeast.
ferroviario que es
We have a
Tren
mega
Maya, que de
project
hecho
down there,
lo
which is
gestiona
the
una entidad del
Maya
gobierno
train,
por sí
which
sola,
is
¿no?
managed by
Nosotros
the
por la parte
government
nada más
itself.
regulatoria.
We
Tenemos
help
también
with
algunos
the
retos
regulatory
en
framework.
seguridad
We also
operativa y
have
seguridad
safety
externa,
and
¿no?
security
En cruces a nivel estamos ahí con acciones
problems. We
pendientes,
have level crossings
avanzando
that
para
need to
mejorar
be
la interacción
looked
de la
after to
ciudad.
improve the interaction in the city.
Y como veníamos de un esquema de
And
empresa nacional,
because
toda la
we
regulación
used to be a
técnica,
national
digamos,
company, all the
era
safety
parte de esa empresa
regulations were part of that
y
company.
se quedó, digamos, un poco suelto ese tema, ¿no?
And the system
Tenemos un
has been
proyecto
left a
de
bit
conversión
unhinged.
de
We
carga del
have
ferrocarril,
a
perdón, de camión al
project of
ferrocarril,
going
con un
from road
esquema
to
de
railway,
incentivos directos a los usuarios,
of direct
que,
incentives
digamos,
for the
vía
users
compartirles los ahorros que esto pueda
via sharing
significar
the
en
savings that this
mantenimiento
may
de carreteras a
bring
cargo
when
del
it comes to
gobierno, ¿no? Ese proyecto
maintaining
está
roads.
iniciando. Y
This is
en
just in
descarbonización,
its
bueno, pues
infancy,
la propia promoción
and the
y el fuerte impulso que tiene el transporte ferroviario,
the drive
tanto de carga
that
como de
the
pasajeros por la
railway
administración,
freight and
vemos que es en sí
passengers
misma
by
una
the
estrategia de
administration is in
descarbonización.
itself a strategy for
Además de
decarbonization.
algunas otras
Plus,
iniciativas,
other
digamos, al
initiatives
interior de los propios ferrocarriles. Por
when it
ejemplo,
comes
Grupo
to
México
the railways.
Transportes
For example,
está
Ruta México Transportes
implementar
is
o poner en operación locomotoras que operan con
will
gas natural,
use
¿no? El
locomotives
Grupo
that
México
use
Transportes, a
natural
su vez,
gas, for
es dueño
example,
de un ferrocarril en
and
Florida
it
que
owns
ha
a
sido,
railway
digamos,
in
el programa
Florida,
piloto de estas
which
locomotoras
is a pilot
de gas
scheme that has
natural.
been going on
Digamos,
with natural
tenemos
gas.
mucha influencia técnica
So we
por
have a
razones
lot of
obvias
technical influence
con Estados Unidos.
with the US for obvious reasons.
Me regreso nada más un poquito a la parte de la pandemia.
Now
El
I
ferrocarril
will refer
fue
to the
considerado en México
pandemic.
una actividad
The
esencial, entonces desde luego
rail
tuvo
was
un impacto
considered an
importante
essential
en el
activity
lado de la
in
demanda,
Mexico when it
pero
comes to
hemos
demand,
estado
but
monitoreando muy de
we have
cerca
been
esta
monitoring
afectación. Se
this
prevé que, digamos, hacia
crisis, and we think
por ahí mediados de septiembre,
that
¿no?
perhaps
se
by
recuperen y empiecen
mid-September
inclusive
things
a
may recover
aumentar los volúmenes respecto al año pasado. Entonces sí
and the
fue un
volumes
golpe
will
muy
begin
fuerte,
to
¿no? En el
rise.
caso
But it
automotriz,
was
por
a
ejemplo,
very,
el
very
tráfico
big
se redujo
shock
hasta
to
el
the traffic. The traffic
95%,
went
pero
down
en el
even to
agregado, digamos,
95%,
va a ser un
but
golpe duro, pero
it'll be
de un
a
impacto
hard knock,
relativamente corto, ¿no?
but it
Entonces van a
won't
estar
have a
en
very
una muy buena
long-term
posición,
effect.
¿no?
It'll
A
have a
diferencia de lo
pretty
que pasó
short-term effect.
con otros modos, ¿no? También recién se
So
aprobó el 1 de
we
julio el
approved
tratado, la
on the
nueva
1st of
versión del
July the
Tratado
new
de
version
Libre
of
Comercio de América del Norte, ¿no? Y
the
por
free
esta vocación
trade
que ya
agreement of
comentaba
North America.
del comercio internacional, los
And when I was
ferrocarriles
speaking
de
about
carga juegan
international
un
trade,
papel
the
fundamental
freight railways have
en esas
a
cadenas
vital
logísticas
role to play in
asociadas
those logistic
al
chains
tratado
that have to
comercial.
do with this free trade
Y bueno, y
agreement.
finalmente regreso
And
al último punto, una disculpa que me había saltado un
back to
par.
the last point, I had
Decía, bueno,
skipped
pues
a
hay esta
few, sorry.
iniciativa de locomotoras con gas natural.
I was talking
Las
about the
flotas de
locomotives with
locomotoras
natural
son
gas, and the
relativamente pequeñas,
fleets
¿no?
of these
Opera
locomotives are
prácticamente
not
toda la
very
red,
big,
salvo la
but
línea
they operate
suburbana, opera
throughout
todo
the whole
con
network.
tracción diésel.
They use
Pero son flotas
diesel,
relativamente pequeñas, ¿no? Que
but they're
podrían
pretty small fleets.
evolucionar a tecnologías más limpias,
And we
relativamente
are
fácil, ¿no?
evolving
Inclusive
to,
ya se
it's
ven en
easy
el horizonte
to
las
move on to
locomotoras
cleaner
que está
technologies.
desarrollando GE Wabtec con baterías,
GE Wabtec
y
batteries is
también
something we're
las
using,
estrategias
and
operativas que
also
también siguiendo
the
la tendencia de
operational
Norteamérica
strategies that go
de esta
in
operación ferroviaria precisa, que es como la nueva
thinking
modalidad de
of
operar,
following
buscando muchas
in North
eficiencias,
America's
también
footsteps.
implica pues,
It also
trenes más
implies
largos,
longer trains,
operaciones programadas de manera muy puntual. También creemos
very,
que
very
va a
specific
abonar
train
en este
operation
objetivo de la
schedules,
descarbonización.
and this will help
Eh,
us also with
Hasta
decarbonization.
aquí mi presentación.
This is my presentation.
Nuevamente agradecerles
Once again, I want to
y
thank you
estoy
all.
aquí a sus órdenes para
I
preguntas y
am
para
here
la
for any
discusión
questions
posterior.
you might
Muchas
have.
gracias.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro.
Thank you,
Súper
Alejandro.
interesante. Yo creo
That was
que
so interesting.
pueden surgir preguntas, o yo voy a
I
tener
think
algunas preguntas
I
sobre
will
esta
probably have
creación de
some questions
institucionalidad,
with
¿no?
regards to this
Que han
institutionality
tenido
creation that you've had
en México de algo
in
tan
Mexico.
reciente y que puede ser
Something
tan
so recent
interesante,
that could be
por lo
so
menos
interesting
para Argentina, cómo lo están
for
viendo,
Argentina
cómo están pensando la
specifically,
regulación
how you're thinking
económica,
about
el
the
caso de
economic
competencia al que te
regulation, the
referiste. La
competition
verdad, todos
issues that
temas
you mentioned. These
súper
are very
interesantes.
interesting issues.
Pasamos al
We will
último
now
de
go
los
to the last of our
panelistas,
speakers.
Jorge Cohn.
Jorge Cohn
Jorge es un experto
is an
internacional con más
international
de
expert
30
with
años de
over
experiencia en
30 years
economía,
experience
planificación,
in
gestión,
economics,
operaciones y
management,
políticas
operations
asociadas
and
al transporte
policies
ferroviario.
related
Es
to
consultor
railway
con el
transport.
Banco
He is a
Mundial,
consultant
con
of
el
the
BID
World Bank,
y con el Banco de
the
Desarrollo de América Latina,
Inter-American
CAF,
Development Bank
y ha
and the CAF,
trabajado con
and
sistemas
he has worked
ferroviarios
on the railway
en 15
systems in
países. Es
15
miembro
countries.
del
He is a
Instituto de
member of the
Transporte de la
Transport
Academia
Institute
Nacional de
of the
Ingeniería
National
de
Engineering
Argentina
Academy of
y
Argentina,
actualmente se encuentra
and
finalizando un
he's
nuevo libro
currently
que
finishing a
revisa
book
los
that
25
reviews
años de concesiones
25 years
ferroviarias
of
de
freight
cargas
railway
en América
concessions in
Latina
Latin
y es
America.
ingeniero
He's a
civil
civil
en
engineer and
transporte.
he
Jorge,
specializes in
bienvenido.
transport.
Adelante.
Hello, Jorge.
Gracias, Julieta. Vamos a ver si recupero la presentación.
Hi, Julieta. Hang on, I will have the presentation now. Thank you, ITF, for inviting me. Thank you to Verónica Raffo, who invited me to this panel. I'm going to tell you a bit. I will speak about Latin America, about Argentina, and I will speak a bit about the future when it comes to the performance of the Argentine railway system in Latin America.
Jorge, disculpas, no se ve todavía tu presentación.
Sorry, we cannot see your presentation yet. Okay, I don't know what to say about that.
Ahí los organizadores están coordinando para proyectar la presentación.
Are putting the presentation up.
Ahí estamos.
Okay, we've got it. Now I can't see it.
Yo la veo perfectamente y creo que el resto de los participantes también. Debe ser algún tema de configuración
It's probably to do with the configuration of your screen. The fact is I cannot control it, so I'm going to tell whoever is controlling the screen to advance, okay? Let's go to the next. One click, thank you. We're going to speak a bit about what has happened in Latin America, very briefly, from the time that the railways were built. If you look at what happened in Latin America, it is really amazing how similar the processes have been. The rail concessions, the Latin American railway systems began with foreign companies, mostly English, French, and North American capitals at the end of the 19th century. The entry of railways has a fundamental role to play when it comes to moving freight and passengers. In Argentina, for example, between Buenos Aires and Tucumán, there is 1,000 kilometers, and trips that used to take 20 days, where you depended greatly on the climate, on the weather and conditions, could be done in 20 hours. The transport of freight and passenger would replace horses, and horse carts, carriages, etc. It was a fantastic change for the regional and the economy and the social behavior of the time. So then, all railways are good. The only ones that are not are the ones that have not been built yet. That is a quote that is at the bottom of the screen. This process of concessions took about 100 years. In the 40s and 50s of last century, we had political ideas of the ideological view of nationalizing, and those concessions are concentrated in original, which used to be French, English, and Americans become one company, and that's when Ferrocarriles Argentinos comes up in Argentina, the Red Ferroviaria Federal in Brazil, the Administración de Ferrocarriles del Estado en Uruguay, Ferrocarriles Nacionales en México y la Empresa Nacional de Ferrocarriles en Perú. The experience of putting all of the concessions in one state company did not satisfy the expectations that we had. And in the middle of the 90s, the capital and private capital and management is reintroduced, and we divided in companies of less size. And when we have to look what model would we follow in order to implement this return of the private sector, we look fundamentally to the US. The US has the most successful and profitable and efficient railway system in the world. A quarter of the world traffic in railways is done by the US. It has class one railways, and it has over 500 railways which are freight. They're small and medium size. And we based the design of railways concessions in Latin America based on what was happening in the US. What do we have now in Latin America? What is the railway panorama when it comes to freight railways in Latin America? We have 41 operators, 30 are private and 11 are public sector owned. If we go left to right, we have 5 in Chile, 2 in Bolivia, 2 in Colombia, 1 in Costa Rica, 7 in Mexico, 1 in Cuba, including the Caribbean, 1 in Panama, 1 in Venezuela, 12 in Brazil, 1 in Uruguay, and 6 in Argentina, considering the 3 lines that are part of the Belgrano Railway, which is now thought of as 3 different ones. So 98% of the railway traffic in Latin America is moved by these private companies, the 30 of them. 98% of the freight railway transport is done by them. This aims to show what happened from 1999 in the 20 years between 99 and 2018. 1999, all concessions were operational. And what we show in blue is the fact that freight transport went up 115%. There is a 4% accumulative a year, and the tons per kilometer went even more, 160%, which it was a sustained rise of 5% per ton kilometer. So the Latin American traffic has gone up considerably in the last 20 years. What do they transport, these countries? What do they transport? Mining represents, used to concentrated mining represents most of the traffic. It used to be 65% in 1999, and all the rest of things that are not concentrated minerals used to be 35%. In 2018, there was a drop in mining, and the rest of the products went up. But clearly, mining represents most, the core of railway transport in Latin America. Argentina is different. It doesn't have the traffic base in mining that Latin America has, which is the blue in the graph. You can see grains, cereals, foodstuffs, and the red, which is above, is building materials, fundamentally cement, stones, etc. So the base of traffic is mostly grains, 60%, and then 30% of building materials. It is more difficult to manage here than in other countries, which are mainly mining. Who transports? We've seen what is transported, but who does it? Who has converted once the concessions were given. A lot of what is transported corresponds to products that belong to the shareholders of the railway companies, to the people who control the railways. This happens especially in Brazil. Many of the railways practically exclusively deal with mining. There is in Brazil a group, a company called Cosan, which is to do with agricultural and foodstuffs. And in Colombia, you have mining. They own the railways, they have the concessions, and they transport their own products. And this also happens in Argentina with Aceitera General Dehesa, a company that transports their own products on their railway, which is oil and cereal. And then Loma Negra, which uses Ferrosur Roca to transport their cement and building materials. What's relevant with regards to this is that railways transport two-thirds of the products of their own shareholders, two-thirds of the total tonnage that is transported in Latin America by railways belongs to the shareholders of the concessionaires. We saw this, Alejandro showed it, and Jorge Kogan did, the strong participation of Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, over 20%, and much weaker. Argentina is here with 4%. There are a very big difference in something that was mentioned by my colleagues in their presentations when it comes to a key area of the profitability, which is to do with traffic density. This graph shows the tons per kilometer that are transported in each kilometer of track of the countries that are shown on the graph. And to tell you in practical terms, it means how many tons go on average for each kilometer of track of the mentioned high density in Colombia. It is a very concentrated network. It almost exclusively transports coal. High density in Brazil, mining. Mexico and Argentina only has 0.5%, so 500,000 tons per kilometer of network, of rail network. This means when you convert this into trains, it means that for every kilometer of the Argentine railway network, on average, there is less than one loaded train per day. On average, less than one loaded train a day. That is the structural problem of the Argentine freight railway system. The problem that we have in our freight railway system is that we have no traffic. And that impedes the financing of the renewal of track once they reach the end of their use of their life. With this traffic, you cannot justify investing in the renewal of tracks that get to the end of their life cycle, to change the rails, to change everything. It costs about $1 million per kilometer. It's unjustifiable. I want to speak about financing. When you speak about railway companies, you think about big companies with lots of income and millions of dollars. The truth is that over half of the 40 railways in the region have lower than $100 million income. So the financing is very difficult to obtain. In the first place, commercial banks do not understand railways. They do not know how the railway system business works. And when they loan money, they ask for repayment of those credits that are incompatible with the slow maturation of railway investment. On the other hand, a lot of the assets of the concession are still the property of the government, so they cannot be used as a warranty against a loan. If a bank finances locomotives and cars and that credit goes on default, for the bank to get these assets is a headache. And when there is a default in a credit for a truck, you can sell the truck very easily and you can recover the money for the credit. But to sell a locomotive will take years. And in the case of cars, train cars, the same, until you get the right place in the world that needs the type of locomotive or the type of car that you want with the right track, etc. So that implies a headache for the bank, and the concessions in Latin America establish that when the investments are done in infrastructure, the investments are the property of the government and they cannot be used for repayment if the credit is defaulted. I should mention the Latin American agenda and the Argentine agenda. In Latin America, in general, concessions is established and we don't observe changes when it comes to the dominant role of the private sector when it comes to freight. And if you want to look at what are the big issues in the agenda, one of them, the first one, is whether we continue with the commercial exclusivity. This implies whether the concessions will continue to establish that only the concessionaire can capture traffic in the concessioned territory. This is something that Alejandro knows only too well. It is a subject that entails only Argentina. How much can we leave this track being the property and can only capture the traffic on their territory by this one concessionaire? The other one is the long-term financial viability of small railways. They have small share, they have low density, they have low income, and this is to do with the survival of long-term networks once the infrastructure gets to the end. And the third issue is to renewing concessions. We will also see this in Argentina, and we still need criteria, procedures, requirements that facilitate how to deal with extending or renewing concessions. And now we'll go to Argentina. What happens in Argentina? We are facing a double challenge. Jorge Kogan mentioned it. In a year and a half, the three main concessions, the three private concessions that we have in our system come to an end. As Jorge said, 75% of the traffic is serviced by them. All of them have had them for 30 years. They have finished. The contracts establish that they can extend it for 10 more years. If they come to an agreement, the concessionaires have said that they are interested in extending the contracts, and the end of concessions is really not very positive. There is a weakening of the maintenance tasks, and this behavior is pretty worrying and negative when it comes to infrastructure. In this sense, in spite of the pandemic, it is important to move as quickly as possible, as soon as the pandemic allows, to be able to deal with this issue. The Ministry of Transport has said that has set out a commission that will negotiate these contracts. This is a main challenge that we have as a country, which is it convenient to extend concessions for 10 more years? This question is due to the fact that 10 years is not very long when it comes to investment in railways. And we don't know, it's a very short-term horizon. I remind you that in Mexico, concessions are for 99 years. And is it viable to motivate this, to extend them for 10 years, or perhaps to rebid for a much longer period, to rethink the participation of the private sector? This is one of the issues that Argentina has. Next. Argentina, in the last 5 years, we made the decision to abandon the vertical and the integration and the commercial exclusivity, and we decided to have open access. The implementation of open access is very much delayed, and it implies challenges that are superimposed with regards to the decisions that must be made with concessions. This will have a much more important role to play in the state when it comes to infrastructure. And those investments must be smart. This means that they need to be concentrated in the corridors that have solid demand levels, with the conscious use of resources that are lacking, that we have faced and that we will face after the pandemic, and to be able to prolong the useful life of the existing infrastructure, the bridges and the tracks. And I'm finished with this. Both issues, the decision to extend or to rebid the concession for 10 years or to have it for a much longer term, and to define what the management model will be, how much we're going to get into open access, will configure and define the future of the freight railway system for the next decades. We are at a crux. We have to define very important issues that will configure our system in future. This is all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. It is important to understand the business so that then we can have recommendations of policies and to see how things can be derived from the road to the railways. I will now give the floor to Azar Janursina from UNSCAP, who will speak briefly about this issue. Hello, I hope you can hear me. My name is Azar Janursina. I work for the UNSCAP in Asia and the Pacific. It is a pleasure for me to be here and to participate in this meeting because I worked in Latin America for a few years with the ECLAC, and I love being back in this region. And Argentina, for me, is one of the countries that I have visited often, and I was able to work with their experts who are very, very valuable. Our colleague Jan, who began this panel, gave us an overview of the situation, and I would give some ideas to have a parallel to what's happening in other areas of the world, then especially in Asia, because I work in Asia now. I'd like to make a couple of comments with regards to the present crisis that we are facing with the pandemic, because what we're seeing in Asia is that it is a very big crisis. It is a shock to the system. And we're wondering whether that could still be an opportunity for the railways of the region and perhaps in other regions of the world. And I would like to share with you some trends that we have seen in what we call the Pan-Asiatic Railway. There is an agreement between governments, so it's a network of the railways of Asia. They begin to the west in Turkey and Russia. They go through the whole of Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia and North Asia, part of Russia, and they go to the Southeast Asia. So they link the countries, and they are using, it is used mostly for freight. And when the pandemic began, one of the things that we have done is to check connectivity in this transasiatic railway network. And we have seen some things that we think are interesting to highlight. For example, there was more resilience of railways when it comes to other modes of transport, especially road transport. We've seen that even with regards to the closure of borders, it didn't affect so much the railways. And we have seen the agility of the responses of the companies that deal with railways in the region, that were able to adapt to the new context. And by doing this, they were able to capture new domestic and international uh, markets. I can refer to India, for example. The railways in India have worked fantastically well when it came to transport agricultural and finished goods, products that have been bought, products that were bought via e-commerce, and it was really an explosion for new services that Indian railways were able to offer in the context of this crisis. Not only medical products, truly milk and uh, agricultural products, foodstuffs, and they were able to supply the whole country with these products that they normally don't transport. The other example of this agility is the rail transport between Asia and Europe. For the past few years, it's been a growing market, but it is the only, when it comes to Asian transport, that registered a growth in the volume of operations between China and Europe in the first quarter of this year, when China was in the midst of the total crisis with the coronavirus. They registered a 20% rise in their operations when you compare it with last year. And thirdly, I would highlight the fact that we saw great support of what we call digitalization of services. The railway companies began to accept electronic documents and the various ways of interacting with their clients, with their partners, and with other people who were involved in these digital services that were that we had to instantly use. Many companies were very, very conservative when it came to this until this crisis arose. Maybe my reaction to this very valuable panel and all of their participants is that how can we have a window of opportunity for railways in the midst of the pandemic, and also to see that the financial cost in the long and medium term could be strong. Uh, we are registering a very strong drop in financial resources and the income, and that is worrying us. We have very important things that when it comes to funding, the resources that are available to support will still be an issue. I want to finish here because I only wanted to react to what was being said. Thank you so much for the chance to be here. Thank you, Azar. I think Azar set out an interesting question. We are facing an unprecedented crisis. We could have some highlights with regards to some traffic that has been able to recover and has had some, because railways were an essential service in most countries, but with the economic crisis that comes together with the pandemic, perhaps a question for Jorge, Gon, or Kogan. How do you think Argentina will fare when it comes to investment that is so important and vital to maintain the infrastructure in the short and mid-term? I think Jorge Con, both have made a comment. Can you answer this question? Jorge Kogan, let me begin. Just a brief short-term comment. The immediate effect of the pandemic has been varied according to the traffic of each railways. The railways that transport grain has had their operation has not been interrupted. The pandemic determined a very strong drop in building and construction, and that impacted greatly on the railways that transport freight to do with building materials, and they have had to almost go into a process of bankrupt. So they have to make decisions with regards to paying their employees, etc. So in the short term, the pandemic has affected in Argentina the railways, a private railway that is to do with the construction sector, which has gone down about 80% in Argentina. One more thing. I believe we are in a very disheartening moment of the railway activity because the concessions are coming to an end. We must define open access for yes or no. It is true that there was an important rise in activity in companies when it is to do with the state management. The country has invested in infrastructure with Chinese financing. China has become an important actor when it comes to financing railway infrastructure, but until we don't define these two central aspects, concessions and management models, I believe it will be difficult to face a relevant investment or growth process. Pandemic is not helpful, really. It is a crisis. The urgencies predominate, and there is a set of challenges that are very, very difficult. It is difficult to sit down and analyze what lies ahead.
Jorge Kogan, ¿querés hacer algún comentario? Ahí estamos.
No quería tomar más tiempo sobre esta
I
pregunta.
did not want to take any more time on this question. Just a couple of things. Let us remember that Argentina is facing a default. We are in a financial situation that is catastrophic for over 2 years and very bad for the last 15 years. We don't have a lot of chances to access international credit. Our savings are completely small. We cannot make investments, and therefore we will have to be very careful when it comes to using resources intersectorially and how to choose priorities. I think this is a big challenge, and it could be the great opportunity to use the money that will be very, very little in the future to better adapt to the needs of the country. The panorama so far is dark gray or black. Thank you. I will now go to English to ask something to
your presentation focused on the potential growth of railway transport and its relation with decarbonization and the environment. And there are two questions related to this. Would you say this is the main reason for governments to implement pro-railway policies, or is there also a driver in transport efficiency? And a second sub-question is, what are the more effective railway policies to recommend to governments? Is it something to give to the market equilibrium, or is it or an active public involvement is required for railways to increase their share in the freight market?
Was that question for me? I couldn't hear the first portion of the question, but if it was the same one that was in the Q&A, I can answer it.
Yes,
if it was for
that's
me.
it.
Okay, that's great. I think there's a direct relationship between cost saving and decarbonization, which is great. A lot of the things that we talk about in terms of decarbonization will directly lead to cost saving as well. For me, roughly speaking, I think worldwide we're talking about 2.5 to 3 trillion ton kilometers that should move from road to rail. That's $500 billion. I think that will be actually saved in terms of effectiveness. We translate that in terms of carbon savings as well. And we translate carbon savings to money at $30 per ton. And that gives you also probably in the region of $100 billion. So there's a definite and direct saving there. I think I didn't have time to go into the details of density, but luckily other speakers spoke a lot about densification. That's what made American railways work. American railways reduced their network, increased their ton kilometers, and saved a lot of money as far as that is concerned. If I look at the developing countries, especially Russia, India, and China, the relationship between network and ton kilometers hasn't changed because a lot of investment has gone into new track, which now has to work for them. I find it interesting the reference to India, and that India was possible to use the rail network to do things during the crisis. The reason for that was obviously there was less passenger trains. So India does not have enough capacity for freight, and that's why dedicated freight railways is being built. What worries me about that is those dedicated freight railways is designed. It's not necessarily designed in such a way that they will attract this freight after COVID. The other thing I wanted to say is what must governments do? I believe in a developing world. I'm sorry to have to say this now. I'm not a strong believer of concessions. It's as simple as that. I believe in central planning. It made a lot of countries work in terms of central planning these days. I believe there should be a central planning model, a central logistics model. There should be a central network design. The country as such must understand all the freight and value chains in that country and have an overarching plan that works for everybody. And in terms of that, you need to do research. In terms of that spatial planning that says where your logistics parks and centers should be, how you should bring the centers of production and consumption together. And then the other thing is user pay. I'm an extremely strong believer of user pay principles. That sorts this out. People pay for emissions, you pay for excessive land use, you pay for congestion, you pay for these things. That will favor the correct behavior in terms of moving freight from road to rail. And there's a lot of hesitancies around countries. They say it will make traffic more expensive. It won't, because it will cause densification, which eventually will make traffic more cheap. So I believe in user pay. I believe in central planning. I believe in intelligence and information about how to make your value chains work in your country. We compete against places like America, where they have a different set of rules. They're already developed. And I think that we could do it differently.
Muchas gracias, Jan.
Thank you, Jan. A question for Alejandro. You were mentioning the fact that Mexico wants to get to 40% of participation share in the railway, and that the systems have a bit of idle capacity. And you mentioned the fact that there was an incentive program for the users, and I imagine this is for the truck users, so they go over to the railways. Can you give us some details about this project? And I also wanted to ask you, what are the levels of fees or tariffs? I don't know Mexico very well, but I understand that the railways is in the midst of a value chain, of a supply chain. So as Jan was saying in his presentation, the railway is part of chains of supply that incorporated in their modality. How do you see the goal of being able to get a bigger share of 40%? And do you think of new chains to incorporate rails, and how do you work out
Claro,
the
Julieta, con
tariffs?
gusto. Y una precisión, y me gustó mucho la
I
presentación
want
de Jorge Cojo, la
to
visión
say that I
completa
really
de
like the vision of Jorge Cojon,
cómo están los sistemas en
particularly
Latinoamérica. En México las
for Latin
concesiones
America. In Mexico,
se otorgaron por
concessions
50 años,
were given
hace,
for
digamos,
50 years,
veintitantos,
about
con un
20
periodo de
some years
exclusividad de
ago,
30,
with an
y son
exclusivity
renovables
period
a
of
otros
30 years,
50
and they're renewable for another 50
exposiciones, que
years.
es parte de lo que vamos
So this is part of what
analizar en
we
este estudio
will
de largo plazo.
analyze in this study that I
Presidente,
mentioned,
por ese asunto de no caer en este
because
incentivo,
we don't want to
de que
fall into that
de que
incentive that
lo que ha funcionado mejor, que es la
what has
inversión,
worked the best,
decaiga
which is
al
investment,
final, ¿no?
may
Sino
drop at the end of the concession
estableciendo
period, to
cómo se ve
avoid
el
that,
escenario para
to
cuando
see how
se vayan a renovar.
the situation looks
De la
once they're renewed.
pregunta de Julieta,
When it comes to the
como decía
question
yo,
that
estamos
Julieta made,
en las fases
we
iniciales
are
de
in the
esa
initial
iniciativa.
phase of this initiative.
Digamos, el planteamiento es
The
hacer una estimación
idea is
muy
to make an
detallada, ¿no? Y
estimate
ahí
which is
contaremos
very
con el apoyo del
detailed,
Instituto Mexicano del
and we
Transporte,
have
que es
the
una
support
institución que
of the
también depende de la
Mexican
Secretaría de
Transport
Comunicaciones y Transportes.
Secretariat.
para
to be
establecer
able
una
to
fórmula muy
establish
clara
a
de lo que
very clear
significa
formula of what it
cada
means
eje y sobre
for
todo la
each
reducción de
issue, especially
convertir
the
tal
reduction
volumen
when
de carga que se
converting
manifiesta
that
en ejes,
volume of
por lo tanto en
freight,
desgaste de pavimentos, ¿no?
which
Si
also
eso,
means, when you make a
digamos,
comparison
significa
between that
100,
and the
compartirle al
wear and
usuario
tear of
una
the
parte, ¿no? O
road,
sea,
and to give the
los incentivos
user a
fiscales
bit of
luego tienen
that
su
uh,
complicación
tax
con
incentive.
los
Then we
ministerios de
have
Hacienda, ¿no?
problems
Y
with
ese
the
probablemente,
different,
digamos, primero
with
será
the
establecer estas
tax
bases técnicas
authorities.
de hacer esta
But
evaluación y
first
después
we do the
convencer al Ministerio
technical
de Hacienda
valuation, and then we have to
que
convince
ya está en el plan sectorial
the
de la Secretaría
economy minister
esta
to
estrategia
give this
de
incentive.
convertir lo más
We have this
posible
strategy to be
de
able to
autotransporte
convert
a
road
ferrocarril.
transport to
Entonces,
rail.
esa es una de
So
las
that is
maneras.
one of the ways that we do
En
it.
efecto,
In
como bien
fact,
comentas, Julieta, el
as you were
ferrocarril
saying, Julieta,
juega un papel muy
the
importante
railway
en estas cadenas
has a
logísticas.
very important
Parte
role to play
digamos,
in these
del
chains.
cómo llegar a ese
Part of
40% es, uno sí,
how to
definitivamente
reach this 40%
ganarle
is
terreno al
to,
autotransporte. Tenemos una
first
red
of all,
carretera y de
gain
autopistas
a
muy
share from the
consolidada,
road.
con
We
muy
have
buena cobertura.
fantastic
En
road
algunos
structure with
corredores
very good coverage.
está muy
In some
saturada, ¿no? Porque
corridors,
también no teniendo
it is saturated
ferrocarril de pasajeros
because
para
there is
transporte
no
interurbano,
passenger railway service
hay
for
muchísima gente
interurban
que viaja en
transport.
automóvil, ¿no?
There's a
Entonces
lot of people who
hay
use
carreteras
cars.
importantes
So there are
que
very
están muy
important
saturadas,
highways that
entonces
are very
ahí digamos
much
cumplimos
saturated.
dos objetivos.
So
Y
then
sí,
we
desde
can
luego integrar
satisfy two
nuevos
different
tráficos, ¿no?
goals,
Vienen,
and also to integrate new traffic.
por ejemplo, esto que decía yo, que
For
este sector
example,
de los
this
productos
sector
especialmente
of
refinados de petróleo ha aumentado
refined
muchísimo
oil
en el caso
products has gone up a lot.
de algunas empresas concesionarias a
In
doble
the case of
dígito.
some concessions by double
Hay
digits,
más de 15
and we
proyectos
have over
de terminales
15 projects for
refinados de petróleo en construcción y todas
terminals for
se
oil that
preocupan por
are being
instalarse con
built
acceso al
with access
ferrocarril.
to the
Hay
railway.
planteamientos,
And
no se descarta que pudiera venir
we don't
más plantas
forget the
automotrices,
fact that more
industria
car
del acero, en fin, o sea,
manufacturers might
estamos
come,
claros que,
steel industry
digamos,
plants.
otro
And one of the
manera de convertir carga de
One of
camión
the
a
ways to
ferrocarril es
convert
combatir la
from
informalidad,
road
¿no? O
to
sea,
rail is to combat
ahí
informality.
estamos con, digo, siempre
So
muy controvertido
it
asunto
is
de
also
pesos y
always
dimensiones, ¿no?
controversial when it comes to
Tenemos una
weight
norma
and dimension. We
que
have
permite bastante más,
rules that
por ejemplo,
allow
que en Estados Unidos, ¿no?
a lot
Tenemos
more than
casos
in
en
the
los que se puede
States.
llegar a tener hasta 70 toneladas en
We
una
can have even
concentración
70
doble
tons
por autotransporte. Entonces, hay un
by
sector, y luego si nos
road.
vamos a la informalidad,
And
a
then
los
if we
casos
go
de
to the
sobrepeso y demás,
informality,
se
to
generan situaciones de
overweight,
competencia desleal.
overloaded trucks, etc.,
Entonces, un primer paso sería controlar
the
que
first step would be to
efectivamente lo que está
control
en la norma de peso y dimensiones
that
se
the
cumpla
dimension and
y
weight
a
is
partir
being
de
adhered
ahí
to,
renovar esta
and
discusión, en efecto, muy controvertida. El sector de transporte
then
es mucho más grande, emplea
to
mucho más gente y
have,
tiene ahí
of
sus
course,
complicaciones
the
muy
road
seguras.
sector employs many more people, so that is even more controversial when it comes to jobs. Thank you, Alejandro. One question for Jorge Con. Is the railway sector profitable for the private sector, and under which conditions, if it is? Interesting, Julieta. Out of this set of 40 companies that I spoke about, there is a group of companies, the Mexican ones, which are completely integrated into the North American system, which are profitable. They have high density. Then there are big companies in Brazil. Many of them are mining companies, high density, a lot of traffic, they are profitable. And then the rest of the railways, even the small ones in Brazil and in Mexico. And we also have the small railways in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Peru. those railways are the ones whether you need to ask yourself whether they're going to be profitable in the long term. They may be profitable enough to cover their operational and maintenance costs, and they may even be profitable to cover the capital cost of the rolling stock. So the capital value of that, the locomotives and the cars, but whether this might be able to finance the structure, I pretty much think it is very doubtful because they are small companies, small and medium-sized companies with low density of traffic. And as we repeated over and over again today, that is key, the density for the viability of the business. So this is a question that is pending. When it comes to renewing the infrastructure that finishes their cycle of life, will need the participation of governments to sustain them and to avoid the reduction of it. Excellent, thank you. A question for Jorge Kogan. Jorge, in your presentation, you spoke about the institutional challenges that Argentina faces when it comes to freight railway. If you had to say, mention 2 or 3 steps or decisions you would make as a country, as Argentina, in order to correct the institutional problem or to improve it so that it may be conducive to the better performance of the sectors, what would be your priorities? I'll give you as a god or the king of Argentina or a transport technical person. Transport. The answer is going to be poorer. In the first place, I believe the legal framework has to be organized because the law that came out in 2015 has created more confusion than we already had, since it gives the government the state can actually draw whatever conclusions or laws that it wants. So this is a new disorder that comes into the institutional conditions that we face now. It is clear that the responsibility for planning and the public policies must be concentrated in the administration, in the government, or the Ministry of Transport, which is responsible for this sector. We need to clarify the roles of the national regulation of transport, which is not really called the right thing. It doesn't regulate anything, this commission. It has a auditing and control of operations role, and private operations at that, because the public companies for railways have recused the role of the CRNT, and this is another confusion that must be cleared up. And finally, beyond how the operational management may be organized, we need a regulation entity that can protect the competition issues and to avoid exclusivity or concentration that has happened in the railways, especially freight. If the institutional structure with the Ministry of Transport, an agency that deals with control and regulation and auditing, and a regulation agency that mediates between conflicts between the state and private companies, you need to check and decide what to do with operation. My personal opinion, given the situation of crisis that we're in, to wait for the Argentine state to reform itself so that it can be an efficient government, I won't see, neither will my great-grandchildren. So I believe I would go back to the situation of having the private sector operate the totality of services. There is a great effort of strengthening capacities institutionally when it comes to professional and managerial capacities, and we can find a mechanism in the regulatory framework to avoid these monopoly type situations by certain operators, and we can get to a better competition, not only for competition's sake itself in abstract terms, but so that competition generates cost reduction, efficiency, and higher traffic in the railway system. All of this within the framework of an economic situation that, if it is as it is at present, is very difficult to convince the private sector to deal with the railway operations, but to make the investments that are necessary. It doesn't seem that the government will be able to invest what is necessary in the short or medium term, and therefore the private sector, with sufficient warranties and risk control, may be able to undertake this responsibility. It is a very difficult task. It requires a great effort, and the state should not waste their resources or energies to move trains, not even to satisfy a social demand, but a romantic view of people who like to see the train go by, but they never take it and they take a bus. And so we're paying for the pleasure of seeing a panoramic, seeing a landscape, and this discussion has not been solved yet. Thank you. Perfect. A last question for Alejandro. Alejandro, other panelists have commented with regards to the challenges that exist in Argentina when it comes to concessions, commercial exclusivity, the discussion with regards to open access in the financing, infrastructure, and refurbishing of the networks. Could you please mention some key points in Mexico when it comes to the decisions that the country has made in order to develop the railway system in an efficient way? What, in your opinion, are the most important aspects that made an improvement and a restructuring of railways in Mexico viable?
Claro, Julieta, con gusto. Yo creo que
I think
este proceso de reestructuración que inició en
this restructuring
95
process began in
es
95.
muy importante tener
It's very
presente el
important
contexto
to
en el que se
remember the
estableció.
context
Digamos que
that we had,
como se maneja en Estados Unidos, se manejó en Estados Unidos previo a la
how
reforma de
it was done in the
1980.
US before
Aquí ya teníamos,
1980.
digamos, nuestro
So we
propio
had
problema de
our own
ferrocarriles, ¿no? O sea,
problem of railways
la cantidad de
then.
personal que tenía Ferrocarril de
The
Trenes de
amount
México
of
era
employment,
brutal, tenía 85
jobs,
mil
we had
empleados, ahora todo el sistema opera con
85,000
15,000.
employees, now we have
Digamos, había una serie
15,000.
de
So there was a series of
problemas estructurales de la
issues
empresa
in the
y
structure of the
se
company.
empieza a planear
And
el proceso en
we
realidad a
began to
partir del
plan the process
91-92.
in 91, 92.
Se toman, digamos, las decisiones de qué
So
estructura el modelo
made the
norteamericano con la
decisions
salvedad
of
de que no
going with
tenemos o
the
tenemos muy
North
pocos de
American
los
model,
ferrocarriles chiquitos
but we have
alimentadores.
very little
Tenemos
of
como
the
tres,
small
tres categorías, diría
railways.
yo.
We have three categories
No
of
como en Estados Unidos
rails,
que hay 500,
not
¿no? En
like
Canadá
in
que
the
hay
US where
40
they have
o sí.
500 or 40.
Pero digamos,
But
a finales de 94 se
in the
da
end of
una crisis,
94, we had a crisis
digamos, sobre todo muy de impacto nacional, pero
with a
muy
national
pronunciada.
effect,
Entonces,
but very strong.
cuando se
And so
establecen ya los
when
términos detallados de
the
cómo se licitan
terms,
las
the
concesiones,
detailed terms of how
hay un
to
contexto de
bid
mucha
for
incertidumbre,
concessions, there
¿no?
was a lot of
Entonces,
uncertainty.
aunque la parte esquemática estaba
And
clara,
although the scheme
sí
was clear,
por este contexto de crisis,
due to this
sí se buscó dar
crisis,
mucha
we
certidumbre
tried to
vía
get a
los
lot of
periodos largos de
certainty
concesión, ¿no? O sea,
via
además
the
de incentivar
long
la inversión,
periods of concession
dar certidumbre, o sea, que
to
el proceso
motivate
generara
so that the
interés, ¿no?
process would be interesting to
Sobre todo
people,
pensando en
especially thinking
combinaciones como las que a la
of
postre se
combinations
dieron de empresas
that
mexicanas asociadas
happened
con empresas americanas. Inclusive
of
hubo
Mexican and
intereses
US
más tibios de
companies
empresas canadienses.
sharing
La exclusividad
and
de 30 años, que
going
eso,
into
digamos,
partnership, the
es
exclusivity
debatible,
for 30 years, which is
si fue
debatable,
mucho, si fue poco,
whether it
digamos,
was
de
too
qué ha
long or
servido
too short. but it has
resolver el problema
served to
principal que era la falta de
solve
inversión, sin
the
duda.
main problem, which was lack of
Y
investment.
la otra cosa es que también se
And
estableció libertad tarifaria,
we
¿no?
also
Salvo los
established
casos
the
donde
freedom
vía la
for
Comisión Federal de
setting the
Competencia
fees,
se puede intervenir
except
a través de nosotros,
we
el
can
Juzgado Superior
intervene
de
if there is
Justicia. Creo que esas
unfair
condiciones
competition,
sí
of course. I think those
tiene su
conditions
parte de éxito.
have
Estamos en este proceso que comentaba yo
been successful.
que
We
hubo un
are now in the
reajuste, digamos,
process of
al
readjusting
esquema de regulación,
certain issues
pero
of
que
the
todavía estamos en este
regulation
proceso de
scheme, but
consolidación
we are still
y después, bueno, pues
consolidating,
pasan por
and
son procesos que luego ¿no?
these are
Pueden tener una
processes
fase
that may
legal, ¿no? De
have
juicios y
a
tal,
legal
y eso, digamos, va estableciendo
phase,
como los
and that
precedentes
will
y ese periodo
establish
en realidad está por
precedent,
iniciar, ¿no? Pero creo que
and
el
that's
momento en el que
what
está
about to begin. But the
Argentina
moment
es
that
interesantísimo,
Argentina
¿no?
is
Coincido
facing is
que
very
la
interesting.
visibilidad de 10 años para la
The
naturaleza de las
visibility for 10
inversiones
years for the nature of
puede quedarse
investments,
muy
I
corta,
agree,
¿no?
is very, very short. Thank you, Alejandro. I think we are over the allotted time. That's what the organizers are saying. I would like to thank you all, the speakers, and everybody who participated of the event, which has been so interesting. I will carry with me some very clear messages. The first one is, of course, the fact that freight railway in Argentina had certain weaknesses when it comes to their financial viability, especially due to the weight of investment in infrastructure. There's doubts with regards to concessions and regulatory, and on top of that, we are facing an unprecedented crisis in our history, and that means that the sector in Argentina is facing a sort of tsunami. In the midst of the storm, the recommendations are very general, but I think what we can see is that we need a clear direction, a clear path from the public sector that needs to have a clearer institutionality, policies with the long term, and railway policies that explicitly try to address the details of the business, the details of the companies, to avoid recommending policies that are not well focused. And this is especially important in critical times. In Argentina, we had very few resources before, and now it's even worse. So if investments need to be done or decisions have to be made from the public sector, it is important to have the tools in order to make the decisions that will have the greatest returns when it comes to social profitability out of the decisions that are made. I want to thank the ITF and Sustentar. And now Francisco Hurtado will speak.
Thank you, Julieta, and thank you also all the distinguished guests and the panelists we had today. I think this was a extremely interesting debate. But the conference will continue tomorrow. We'll be debating ports and inland waterways, and it's two topics actually, and it's not by chance that one session happens right after the other. As we heard here in several of the interventions, this connection between the ports and the railways is absolutely essential. I remember Alejandro saying that in Mexico, all the 12 major ports are connected to the railways, and any country that has an efficient and a freight railway system with high modal share, it's it's always connected to the ports. Of course, there's other industries, and we also heard Jana Venga talking about it. But this is absolutely essential. But this is a discussion for tomorrow, and not just the ports. Tomorrow we'll also focus on the inland waterways, and we know that in Argentina they are also relevant, and in other neighboring countries. And we'll have persons from Brazil, from Paraguay, and of course from Argentina, and international experts to discuss these two things. And the session, like today, will be at the same time, 3 hours Paris time, 10 hours Buenos Aires time, and I invite you to participate. Um, Also, I remind again. This is it's a recurrent reminder, but I remind all our participants that these video recordings, uh, the presentations that you've seen today, they are going to be available in our website. The link is here. I believe in the chat my colleagues have already shared it and could share it again. um, I also remind the hashtags we use on Twitter, the LinkedIn group too, and there were in the debate we had opportunity to see several questions debated, answered. Um, some of them were not. Unfortunately, there was not time for all of them, but these are questions that can then be addressed in our LinkedIn group, and we'll try to foster that debate. For instance, I have to mention this: the issue of having a trans South American connections, like we've seen in Mexico, the importance that NAFTA and the connection to North America has, to the United States and Canada. Uh, could Mercosur also play a similar role, and could rail help this integration? Of course, this would require huge investments, and we know the period we are facing. But this is among the several very interesting topics we approached. We didn't debate that one, but maybe it can be for the LinkedIn group. And then, of course, in the web page, you can see all the information about the conference, all the biographies of the speakers, etc. It's all there. And finally, I repeat, in behalf of the International Transport Forum, the other organizations, the Portal Institute, Sustentar, the Ministerio the Transport Ministry of Argentina. I thank Julieta, first of all, the moderator of this debate. Thank you for moderating and introducing the topic and summarizing it. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the four participants and Azara that also made the floor intervention. So Jana Venga from South Africa, Jorge Cohen, Jorge Kogan, Alejandro Reis, thank you very much for your inputs. And I'm sure we'll keep in touch. And for all the participants, I hope I can see you can see us tomorrow to debate ports and inland waterways.